This morning, the committee will be holding a discussion on Baroness Casey's review of standards of behaviour and internal culture at the Metropolitan Police Service. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any interruptions. Can I now ask our clerk, Lauren, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Dr Sahota, for whom Assembly Member Duval is substituting.
Thank you, Lauren. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 22nd of February 2023 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Great.
Thank you. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recent action taken by me under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members to respond to the monitoring officer's draft paper related to complaints received against the Mayor of London?
Noted.
Thank you. So we now move on to our main item of business, and I would like to welcome our guests who are joining us for the first part of this session. Baroness Casey of Blackstock, DBE, CBE, and Sarah Kincaid, lead reviewer. Did I pronounce that correctly? Kincaid, I do apologise. First of all, ladies, thank you so much for coming to our committee, because I do appreciate just how busy you are, especially today. I'm going to start with questions, but first of all, I would like to say that the report mentions the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Command, and there are clearly some issues there. But I would also like to point out that, very sadly, it was 6 years ago today that we lost PC Keith Palmer, 6 years ago, PC Keith Palmer of that group. So it just shows that there are good and bad wherever we look, and we remember him, colleagues, today. So thank you. We've all got various questions, so I've been very ruthless with my colleagues to tell them to be nice and short with their answers, and I'd be really grateful if you can be as concise too. I noticed when we're looking at how you did your questioning that around 6,500 people responded to the survey. Can I have sight of that survey, or can we have sight? Couldn't find it when we looked for it. Sorry, yes.
Actually, may I, Chairman, just start by saying how grateful I am to you and the committee for giving us the chance to appear before you this morning. And I too would like to mark that this is the anniversary of the sad death due to a terrorism attack of Police Constable Keith Palmer. I would also like to say, as I have said throughout this review, that as we sit here at this time in the morning, and I saw them on the way here, there are police officers out responding to 999 calls. There will be a woman somewhere in London that is probably making her first account of a rape that happened to her yesterday or the day before. Always we have to remember that the police have to stand up when we are under duress and there is a threat, and that they stand in the line of duty to do that. And in fact, over the weekend, I think, as colleagues will know, there were 2 off-duty officers that actually stood up to a crime that was happening in Soho. So I think as much as this report is very grave, it has quite significant findings. I don't think any of us should underestimate, and I have said this on camera throughout, and I have said it to colleagues, staff and officers in the Metropolitan Police by way of an internal video, that I'm very conscious of that, and that we are grateful to them for that, and that happens 24 hours of the day, 7 days a week. They are not a profession or a function that can close itself down for a week or 24 hours to think about what it might do next. So reforming itself is always reforming itself whilst it's running 24 hours of the day, and I think that is in itself a huge challenge. In answer to your question, Chairman, and I am not great at being concise, so if anybody's going to mess up this morning, it will be me,
okay.
Not anybody else in the room. But essentially, the Ipsos Mori polling is threaded throughout the report. We have given it separately to anybody who wants it. I'm very happy to do so. It took place over, I think, a relatively... Do you want to say what we did? Brilliant.
We undertook it, I think it was in the lead up to Christmas, and then we did, as well as the survey of officers and staff, we also undertook a survey of Londoners just shortly after. And we had a very, very good response to to the officer survey, Ipsos were really pleased at the response rate. And we did a couple of questions where we've compared how officers and staff have reflected their views as opposed to the views of Londoners, which you might have picked up in the report.
Thank you. Normally people are prepared to answer something when they've got a beef against something. Did you find that, or did you find that you had lots of positive answers to your questioning?
Well, if I can potentially predict where you may be heading, Chairman, that the report asks very open questions. You can see the questions and you can see the answers for yourself. I think that what we have to be mindful of today is that both police officers and police staff completed that survey. We've taken testimony from countless others. I've done visits and listening exercises throughout the last 12 months with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of officers. And what the report reflects is what the staff and officers of the Metropolitan Police think and feel about the organisation. It's not a report that is attempting in any way to reflect anything other than that. I do not have a beef, quite the opposite, with the Metropolitan Police. At all, in fact. Quite the opposite, in fact.
Let me correct. I was talking about the people that were coming to answer. I'm not suggesting by any means that it's you. I'm saying people are more likely to get involved in questionnaires if they themselves have an issue. And I wasn't going anywhere other than saying, did you get people that were positive as well as negative? It was not reflecting you, it was reflecting the people that responded.
Yes, and that's reflected in the report, that you'll see that we've put it all in, both positive and negative. So throughout the review, there are answers that are more positive and answers that are more negative, and that's what we've reflected.
Okay, thank you. Have you removed anything from the main draft reports that came up, or you've left it more or less as it intended to be?
Are you referring to the Ipsos Mori survey?
No, the report in general. Did you present a report anywhere and was asked to change anything, or was it literally as you wanted it to be?
So there's always, in the terms of reference, there was an agreement which we've honoured very positively from both sides, that the Metropolitan Police will be able to have full access to the report in draft and could give both factual feedback, and frankly we took factual feedback from the Commissioner, the Deputy Commissioner and the organisation, as well as other views. So I decided, given the situation, that I gave them an early copy, I think round about mid to late February, and we went through a process of receiving their feedback. As you can see, it's a 360-page document. So it had a couple of rounds of feedback, and so we went through those fairly thoroughly, so that we could agree that the contents therein were accurate in terms of the Metropolitan Police as well as ourselves. I have to say, if there are mistakes in it, then we take responsibility for those, not colleagues in the Met Police. Okay,
no, I just wondered if it had been changed very much, but you've answered that. Very, very briefly, because of my time as well, I'm thrilled to see that you are not best pleased with BCUs, because I've been banging on a long time that I think that's when we started to lose connectivity in the boroughs with them, and I appreciate your comments on that. But very briefly, because of my time, what are the staff's views of the BCUs as compared to borough-based policing?
So I think that I have concluded, and I think Sir Mark Rowley is in agreement with this, that we haven't suggested in recommendations restructuring, either huge or i.e. the overall Met, nor indeed have I suggested restructuring in terms of the BCUs. In part, Chairman, because I think it's always an easy option for review to go down the structural route. It is much more difficult for colleagues to... you can't restructure your way out of a cultural problem, let me put it that way. I think that is one of the areas where I would suggest that over the last decade potentially mistakes were made, in that the BCUs essentially are very big. They lost their connection on a borough-by-borough basis. I think one of Sir Mark and Dame Lynn's first suggestions, and they're enacting it, is to put a lead superintendent into each borough, and I'm hoping that will restore some of the glue. And I think, again, that what we also note in the report is that that restructuring, which I personally have made very clear I think was financially driven, essentially that restructuring alongside then essentially sort of neighbourhood policing also disappearing to the degree that it has. What you see is a London that is very sort of a police service that's actually quite disconnected from both boroughs, but also more importantly the people living in those boroughs.
Yep,
so it's
I
both
agree.
a sort of accountability and also a reality of the day-to-day experience of Londoners in terms of our glue often being the safer neighbourhood teams and things like that. So I think you're right about that, and I think that there's been a cross-party response yesterday in terms of leaders of local authorities across London also saying good to have this recognised in the report and good to talk about it. So I think it's a really important place actually that this is one of the things that this committee in particular should have more to say on, as it were, than other forums, because I think you are also democratically elected by the people of London. So I think it's a very important connection for you to be satisfied with.
Good, thank you. We're coming on to where this committee stands with another colleague, but I'll go now to Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Baroness Casey, and good morning, Ms. Kincaid. Firstly, Baroness, can I, on behalf of my Labour colleagues, thank you for, and Ms. Kincaid for all the work that you've done in compiling this report, which we accept. We welcome it. Baroness Casey, the culture of the Met has proven resistant to change over the decades. Even before Macpherson's landmark report, there were many, many reports going back to the 60s and 70s talking about issues that you address in your report. The Commissioner has made a good start by accepting that there are serious issues to address. How can he overcome the deeply entrenched attitudes that are resistant to change? Does his failure to accept that these problems are institutionalized within the Met hinder this?
The job for the Commissioner and the Deputy Commissioner is huge. And I think that when they probably applied for the job and got the job, they had a sense of the enormity of what they were taking on. In the same way that, as the report shows, the officers and staff of the Metropolitan Police also feel that things need to change. This review was done with colleagues. It's not a done-to review. I've been in other places, for example, in Rotherham, Metropolitan Borough Council, where actually from the arrival we realised that we weren't going to get cooperation. We weren't getting an open door. And to be fair, Deputy Chairman, that the Met have been phenomenal in opening up their organisation. I don't think anybody has had the sort of help, support and actually kindness and graciousness that we've enjoyed and needed, actually, given how tough the job has actually been. So I think I want to be quite measured today in terms of making sure that I'm really clear about this particular issue, because the findings of the report go far beyond the issues of institutional racism, misogyny and homophobia. Overall, a culture of discrimination and prejudice, which is illustrated fairly graphically in the report, and that prejudice and discrimination is suffered by many of their own officers and staff. So when you have statistics that say that close to 50% of the staff and officers are themselves experiencing racism, 33% of women, and I think that having interviewed and listened to so many women, their bar on what they would consider sexism is potentially lower probably than my bar would be, and many others in other public sector organisations. So for 33% of them to say that they have experienced sexism, and the 1 in 10, which is a deeply worrying statistic that says that women officers and staff have actually experienced harassment and assault, is pretty graphic. And then the issues in relation to gay officers also experience homophobia, also not easy reading. Do I think that all of that adds up to institutional, organisational, systemic, pick whichever word you want to? Yes, it does. Do I own the Macpherson definition? Yes, I do. Do I think that Macpherson definition allows everybody to know that there are not every single serving officer? It's so clear. And I know that it's really hard because actually 30 years ago, Stephen Lawrence lost his life. 24 years ago, William Macpherson wrote his report. If I hadn't found and I've got 4 tests, I will be much shorter on the other questions, but I think it's really important that I lay this out. I have 4 tests that I have put into my report, which I think gives everybody a fresh start. It gives Londoners a fresh start. It gives the Met a fresh start. It gives its officers a fresh start. It gives the Commissioner a fresh start. And those 4 tests are these. 1, do you have racists in your organisation? Yes, you do. Does that make every person working the Met Police? Absolutely not, and I'm absolutely clear about that. Second test, do you have people in your organisation experiencing, let's take misogyny? Yes, you do. Not everybody is experiencing misogyny or sexism in your organisation, but enough for you to be concerned that you should do something about it. Do you have systemic and therefore is your institution's processes biased disproportionately? Yes, they are. 81%. I'm sitting in a room where nearly everybody in this room is white, and I can say to everybody in this room who is white, 81% of people with a skin colour that is black are disproportionately more likely to be in the misconduct system. That cannot be because their skin colour is not mine. There is another thing happening there. And then fourthly, and isn't it time that we all had a fresh start on this, for the officers and the staff, as much as for Londoners, that without a doubt, previous commissioners, previous politicians have accepted the disproportionality that black communities suffer. They are over-policed and under-protected. The use of stop and search, over-policing, over using force disproportionately to a skin colour that is different to mine, and balanced against that if a woman is black, she is 65% more likely to be on the receiving end of domestic violence. Even if you take all of that together, if you take all of that together, for me, this was the moment to say to Doreen Lawrence, to the countless people out there, yeah, this is institutional, it's organisational, and then you can move on to then have a more straightforward and a direct discussion with the people of London. And I think in a way it's sort of time and I sort of wish in a way that we didn't have to talk about it today, but we could gift the new Commissioner the time and the space to actually allow himself and his organisation to hear the findings of this review, to consider particularly the ones that have been with the Met for a long time, and take a moment, I suppose, or a month or 2 months to actually then consider it, because it just rings hollow to say, I don't like the word, and it's not a word I would not use. And I know Mark Rowley, he is a man of utter decency and integrity. So we need to give him time and we need to give him the respect that he needs and he warrants, as does his Deputy Commissioner. You know, if somebody said to me, you know, Louise, Met's in a terrible place, you should bring in people to take it over to run it, I would think that there are possibly no more 2 outstanding leaders that I could think of than Lynn Owens and Mark Rowley. So I appreciate that this is difficult and I appreciate everybody wants to have that sort of debate, but I'm just asking for the gift of a little bit of sort of generosity of time and gentleness as we move into the debate. And so I have asked them to think about how must it feel to wake up if you're Doreen Lawrence in April. I'm asking them to think about what does it feel for the countless black Londoners that are working in their force, let alone people on the receiving end of some of what they do. So I'm asking everybody today, can we just keep this a little bit where it is and give people time to listen to each other?
Thank you, Chair. In the interest of time, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Assemblymember Russell.
Thank you. And I think that the point that you make about the impact on serving Met officers of this institutional, the systemic difficulties that you have uncovered, really shocking things, is a really important point and very well made. I understand what you say about the gentleness that is required, but I think that Londoners, many Londoners, those Londoners who've been over-policed and under-protected, need to hear that after decades of knowing about institutional corruption in the Metropolitan Police, that it is being taken seriously. And I think that's there is a problem that the term institutional racism, sexism, misogyny, homophobia, that it's become so politicised that the Commissioner wasn't able yesterday to just say, yes, there's a systemic problem, because Londoners really needed to hear that.
So may I just say, Assembly Member Russell, from my own bit of London, when people say something's become politicised, it's often a get-out-of-jail card for the word difficult. I've heard it so many times. I'm sorry, you're dealing with a dinosaur. I've been around a long time. And sometimes it is right that we step into what is difficult, and using political, particularly when people like me, I say, oh, I'm independent, I'm not political, I don't want to get into that debate, is actually sometimes a watchword for it's difficult. It is difficult. And in a way, the gentleness has to go both ways. The Met have to realise, the Commissioner and the Deputy Commissioner, that they also owe gentleness to the people of London that want a recognition that their organisation is organisationally, systemically and institutionally biased. And in a way, what I'm sorry, I'm sort of I hadn't actually thought about this before my mouth opened. I've been trying to think overnight how to guide us all through this difficult process, that we respect and acknowledge the extraordinary difficulty. I mean, the statistics in the report are so sad when it comes to black Londoners and non-white Londoners, both in terms of our own staff in the Metropolitan Police and their own officers. So I'm asking really today for gentleness both ways. I'm asking the Met to just take a moment and think about what it might feel and what people are hearing when people won't use a particular word, a kind of don't die in a ditch over it. And I'm asking people to sort of, own where we are with this, which is this is the lived experience of people in the organisation and with people without of the organisation. And I think it's the race one, that finding that people are finding so hard. I doubt, my gut feeling is, and I haven't had this conversation, I'm having it live probably on camera here, would we be in the same place if this was just about sexism and misogyny, or would we all just chalk it up and say it? Would we be in the same place, I don't know, if this was about homophobia? I don't know, the fight to be treated as equal if you are gay is more recent in our memories. It's not that long. It was a David Cameron government that put through the equalities that allowed people that are gay to get married. That's really recent. So I just wonder that this is deep into the history of London, and that, in a way, means that we should not call it political. And actually, what's wrong with being political? You're all political. You are democratically elected. It is your job to be political, and it is for civil servants and people in Mark's position to think about how they serve the public and how they serve democratically elected members. I am not political in that way. I'm not affiliated to any political party, but I'm very happy to talk politics, and when politics gets difficult, let's talk about that difficulty.
Well, let's, Assembly Member, you've had your time. Do you want a very, very quick and a very short?
I just wanted to very, very quickly ask about the issue that you raise in the report about MOPAC and access to data, and particularly around strip search. And I mean, I recognise that massively because I have a question that I put in July 22 about the locations of more intimate strip searches of children. And it was really shocking to see that MOPAC have been unable to get hold of data on these strip searches because the coding of the events was being done in such a random way that there was no consistency and it wasn't possible to look at it properly. So I just wondered if you would like to comment on the on that lack of data and the problems that MOPAC have been having getting hold of data from the Met, because that is the Met came in the 12th of September.
We have to be fair to everybody.
Yes, yeah. I know.
I can see Baroness Casey will be able to answer that very quickly for us, or certainly get back. Baroness Casey, can I ask you if you could lower your microphone? No, on camera it's right in your face, and we would like everybody to be able to see you. I'm sure it's much better lower. Thank you.
If I could just answer that briefly, and I will be brief. The problem of data in many different forms, not only in relation to the problem that you were talking about, but in relation to the misconduct data, in relation to body-worn video, right across the piece, we found very complicated and difficult data sets to understand, and they're ridden with sort of inconsistencies and inaccuracies. It was very difficult. If I could just mention one particular issue that we found very concerning, is we looked for about 3 months to get data on the number of cases each public protection officer was holding, and we never got to the bottom of it. You know, we talked to many, many different officers. We looked right through every system we could. And we had to rely in the end on the Met's latest estimate that they had, which was, I think, 18 to 21 cases per officer, which I think they put in their force management statement. However, many officers we spoke to were carrying an awful lot more than that, so it's the officers who interview women were also very much were carrying sort of, double that number.
Thank you, and that is reflected in the report as well. Thank you. Assembly Member Pidgeon.
Lovely, thank you. And thank you so much, Baroness Casey, for this report. I have spent the last 24 hours reading it really thoroughly, and I think it's going to be shaping our work over the next year. You talk about toxic masculinity, you talk about over-sexualisation in the workplace, carrier culture. How is Sir Mark and his team, how are they going to tackle these fiefdoms, these bastions, under control of this small clique that have been there a long time and have clearly some awful views and poor management practices, and almost how many officers do you expect the Met to be getting rid of as a result of what you have found, and if processes are improved in terms of misconduct?
I think the first thing to say is that there is a deep recognition by the new management of the Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner that things need to change, and specifically in those dark areas where their behaviours are just off the barometer. I think that the challenge will be that people have tried to do it before. So I think what's quite interesting is that it's the overall report really, which is, other sort of senior people have gone into some of those units at quite senior levels, but they've gone in and been overwhelmed. And I think this really is almost like a metaphor for the Met, which is, two people cannot a culture change. And so what has to happen is that there has to be sort of a acceptance. And I think it's interesting that, I haven't looked in detail yet, but certainly as we move towards the end of the report, we felt that we are holding up a mirror to what many people in the organisation already think and believe. So we weren't pushing against something, we were with the tide, as it were. And I think that's where I've made a recommendation that I believe has been accepted, which is in some of the areas where one has the most concerns, you would actually bring in people from outside, which is not a very Met thing. The Met isn't great. It says it brings in good practice. It doesn't really. It's not great about that. Like, we're the biggest, we're the best, we're the bestest, we're the biggest. I think today they will recognise that that's gone for a bit, actually. I hope they become the best for London. I know that they can be, and then I want them to be the best for the world again. But right now, that's something they have to earn back, frankly. And so I think that's why in some of those areas, so for example, in cleaning up the Met has to be the top priority for this commissioner, alongside the deal for women and children in London. In order to clean up the Met, they need to bring some people in from outside to help them do that for two reasons. One is because I think trust of many people that they can do it for themselves doesn't exist. So there's a huge level of cynicism within their own workforce. And we show it very clearly that essentially those patterns of if you complain, you get sidelined. You know, let's take the one that, you know, for many reasons in a world where we say we're serious about violence against women and girls, if 95% of the police-perpetrated domestic abuse and violence cases have no further action, I ask myself whether that's correct, and I now know that is because they do not believe the women that are coming forward and they don't process it. So one is I don't think they can do it on their own, because just adding extra officers from one bit of the Met into another bit of the Met is not going to change it. So when people say, I've added more people, it's not going to work alone. It's helpful, but it won't work. And secondly, I think it's a metaphor more broadly, which is we've cranked the Met open. That's our gift to the Met and to the new Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner. And essentially, whilst it's open, let's keep it open. That's your borough by borough consideration as well, Chairman. I think that's well made. How do you keep it open? And part of that is bringing people in from outside. And I have to say that many police chiefs around the country have said, just by text and email in the last 24 hours, how refreshing that is. And that, you know, the thing about Mark and Lynn is I don't think they are defensive about it. I don't think that they are in denial about it. And I think they will go and get some decent people and bring them in. It's just having the creativity to realise who will they be and how will they help. And not as advisors. That's the other thing. You know, you need people in the organisation doing, rather than telling the organisation what to do. Do you see what I mean? And there's a culture, isn't there, in lots of public services that we're long on getting advice in and short on actually getting people to do the changes. And I don't, you know, that's clearly what happens in the Met. But actually, I don't think it's just the Met.
And do you have a feel for the number of officers that could end up being removed as a result of all of this? Because some people, in fact, officers on the radio have said they felt they were complicit in this because that was just how things were and you just kind of got your head down and carried on with the job.
So I think the answer is on two fronts, actually. We don't know the answer to that question, and that is concerning enough in itself. Both for myself, you know, you've got an outstanding newly appointed Assistant Commissioner in Barbara Gray that brings with her the experience of moving from the RUC to the PSNI. I mean, you couldn't have more brilliant experience and, you know, a really head held high when it comes to misconduct and professional standards. So they've installed a great leader. They now need to install people around her and the team that think differently and act differently. So Mark will have a greater sense for himself. I just know that we're not talking hundreds. We are talking several hundreds, would be my estimation, and I think that would be the same. I think Sir Mark will say the same thing later on this morning, and we haven't crossed notes.
Thank you very much.
That's good to hear. Assemblymember Garrett.
Morning. I suppose, slightly parochially, really, thinking about this committee. I suppose it'll take me a while probably to think of the Casey report not as being about child sexual exploitation. That report stuck with me, and in particular, I think something that sticks with me in my work now is this sense that there are people in public office who knew things or suspected things or could have found out things and did nothing. That's something actually I challenge myself with regularly as a result of reading that report. So when I read this report and I think, what can we as individual members of this committee and what can this committee do, seemed to me, I mean, there was not much out of 360 pages about this committee. It seemed to me there were two things that struck me. One was that transcripts of this committee, it's a rare forum where scrutiny happens in public, and that was obviously a resource that you drew on in creating your report. And then secondly, obviously our job is to challenge MOPAC. And I think one of my colleagues is going to ask about MOPAC and also to sort of air concerns that have been raised by HMI. But I wondered whether you had thoughts on what this committee could be doing better, could be doing differently, and could make sure that we really are in the role that we have in this sort of scrutiny ecosystem, are actually making sure that all these problems that are exposed don't just get forgotten.
Well, this is one of those Sir Humphrey moments where I have to work out, do I talk in code and do a Sir Humphrey, or do I...
So it's my question, so I'm going to set the terms. I would like brutal honesty, because I think there's no point hemming and hawing about an issue that's so serious.
Well, and
if
that's
you think we're useless, then please say, and then we should reflect
No,
on that.
I would never, I wouldn't say that. And actually, your reputation goes before you. If I was asking for a fresh start for the people of the Met and the people of London and the commissioners and MOPAC and yourselves, I would ask you to put yourselves in that fresh start as well. That I think we have to draw together. Politics is important. You get elected, you have to represent your own people, your own party. I understand that. I haven't and wouldn't unless I was asked. I didn't do a major deep dive into this particular committee, but I have noted that people dread appearing before it. It takes up hours and days of their lives. It happens regularly, so that's quite a lot of time out of people's lives that they have to get themselves briefed up to know what lines to take. I've worked for Prime Ministers, I've worked for Secretaries of State, I've worked for Ministers. I respect that process. Nobody should appear before a committee like this unless they know what they're talking about and they respect your power and your authority. Gently, I would ask you that in the sort of months to come, there is just more a kind of coming together once the Commissioner has a strategy. So remember now, he's out for consultation on a turnaround plan. In the middle of that consultation, this review drops. No matter how much he knew, and they knew, because they've been on this journey with us, this was going to be a tough call and a tough ask. Tough by their people, as much as tough by me. I think they need time to pull together to the next strategy that will go from being a turnaround plan, I think, to a reform plan for the Met. They need every single officer and staff member to pull behind them. They can't do this unless they have that support. So quibble though I may, and not just quibble, passionately believe about some of the language that I have used, and I will stand by that language. I also think it's time that, you know, from April this year, or whenever they publish the next version, that we all hold them to account for that. Because not so much, I mean, I can't really comment too much on this committee, but I feel scrutiny should be a process that helps, not a process that is dreaded and hindered. It hinders and it's dreaded. And I'm not speaking for Mark Rowley, for Lynn Owens, for Cressida, for Steve House, or for any of the others. I'm just saying collectively, as their sort of staff association representative this morning, that this has gone beyond a sense of being held account to a sort of hindrance, and the stakes are just too high, Mr. Garrett, and I think you know that because that's why you mentioned Rotherham,
yes,
which is seared. We did Rotherham together. Sarah was the lead inspector on that report. So the stakes are high, and I would ask you just to step back, consider your role, think about how we actually help the Met get onto the next stage. That's probably too blunt, but that's what I think.
Thank you.
Perhaps. Is that my
Your
time? Okay, thank you.
The trouble is, we'd all like to ask you so many more questions, so forgive us. Assemblymember Moyama.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to meet you both. I was up until 8:02 reading your whole report. I didn't read the appendices, but whilst reading it, I was thinking to myself that I was just starting primary school when Stephen Lawrence was murdered, and at the rate that you've outlined in your report in terms of progress around race, misogyny and LGBT hate, I'll be in my 70s before that's fixed with the current rate of progress. And I know that Sir Mark has a plan in place, which is a really positive thing. But I think my question is, well, in two parts really. It relates to Assemblymember Garrett's question about the way that the police operate and the structures, rather than who knew what when. But that turnaround plan that Sir Mark has, we've had, as others have said, report after report after report, and it feels like virtually no progress has been made. And I worry equally for, I'll just use the example of Black Londoners because for obvious reasons that's the example I know best, but also for those Black and minority ethnic staff and those women who work in the police service who run a gauntlet every day going to work and are at risk of losing their jobs and being stuck at the bottom of the ladder in perpetuity if they do stay. But in terms of the report itself, I was really struck by the fact that you mentioned over and over that at every level, and you mentioned senior management. I know that you're not talking about Sir Mark and Dame Lynn, but there are, there's a withdrawal from wanting to make those changes. And having spoken to one of my 3 BCU commanders in the last week or so, the levels of management that you outlined between the BCUs and the senior staff at the Met, the first layer at the Met, Scotland Yard, how does meaningful change happen? Because it strikes me that there is a big problem in this big wedge section that nobody gets to see. The people of London get to see the bit at the bottom, which has been decimated and depleted, and they are run ragged, and there also are bad people in their midst, and they live in fear of them, Londoners and staff alike. What would be your assessment of how to deal with the resistance from people that have been in the organisation for a long time at all levels, but in particular in the senior parts of the Met, to make it better?
I think, first of all, is sort of taking the time to let a 360-page review and every thought and every part behind it to seek to ask their colleagues and staff what they think is behind it, what they have said, what they think. A sort of openness, really, to question oneself, I think, is the starting point. And I completely understand that the Commissioner arrives, he can't not do something. I mean, so, and we'd all be all over him if he didn't, and there'd be another bit of my report that said, well, the new Commissioner arrived and didn't do anything for 6 months. It's a no-win situation, isn't it? Now that we are where we are, I think what I'm looking for is just a much more wholesale involvement of officers and staff across all of the layers you've just described, which essentially we did feel, believe, let me just be clear, I'm a woman, I always use the word feel, I should, woman up for a minute. I think, believe and can evidence that the disconnect between the specialisms and the what they call basic command units, I wish we would go back to call them borough command units, that might make people feel in them they're a little bit more than a basic cop, and in a way that in itself is symbolic of something, isn't it? That they forgot their people when they did that restructuring. They didn't just forget the Londoners, they forgot their people. To my mind, the police officer that responds to me in a 999 situation, or is the first person I talk to when I've been sexually assaulted, or actually when I'm an elderly person who's been burgled, true story, in my street, and actually the young probationer cop that comes to see her, to talk to her, they are the people that are the most important people. They are the people that carry the responsibility for policing by consent in London. And yet, what did we do? We called them basic. And worse than that, and they talk about being busted back into uniform, or I had to go back to the borough, or, in order to get promoted, they had to go and do some specialism over here. This sort of elitism, which I probably think is policing overall, not just London, but you see it writ large in London. I think it's time as well that the manner with which they deal with the contents of the review is going to be so important. So, I hope it's okay that they don't mind me saying this, but, Mark, Lynn, Louisa Rolfe, Barbara Gray, all of them spent, I think, my days are now getting confused because somebody attempted to spin the report ahead of time, so it could have been Thursday. But they'd already put a meeting in. We discussed it about how they were actually going to talk to the vast majority of people in their organisation, from superintendent upwards. They've had a special conversation with the chief superintendents that run our boroughs, who in my mind are some of the most important people in the Met. And it's symbolic, isn't it, that in their sort of Monday morning roundups, they don't have the chief superintendents that run those boroughs. So you have people that we are all completely reliant on for policing, not involved in those conversations because they report up to a commander, the commander reports to a deputy assistant commissioner, the deputy assistant commissioner reports to the AC, the assistant goes into the DEP, and then the deputy commissioner reports. We can't carry on like this. You are democratically elected members. Local authority leaders are democratically elected. Each of those basic, can we just change the name, borough command units are representative, I think most of them the size of a force outside London. You know, in a way, the leaders and yourselves, it's a different structure, alongside the mayor, are the equivalent of police crime commissioners. So when I see that colleagues that are leaders across the political divide, actually, talking differently about it, not feeling they can get information, they'll get communication, but it's not information that they can then work out what's happening in their borough. So for a kid to be tasered, 10-year-old to be tasered by the TSG on a borough, and it takes the borough commander 10 days to find out how that happened, just undermines him before he can even open his first coffee in the morning. So, you know, I think two answers to the question. One is I detect in the current new leadership a much greater understanding that they can't just stand at the front and shout or tell, that they've got to realise this has to go through right the way through. And jumping over some of your middle and going out directly and listening is one of those important exercises that we did. And secondly, I think there's a real challenge here for chief execs of local authorities, leaders of the local authorities, yourselves as assembly members and the mayor and London councils to sort of work out what would that connection look like? How would you improve it? Not hindering colleagues in the police, but helping the people you represent have more information and more candour. You know, a little target for me would be that the borough commander is able to take responsibility for any policing that happens in his or her, God willing, borough, and that they're not left behind as other people come in and do things. That has to stop, or else we're all undermining policing by consent if we don't allow cops to be responsible for how they manage that consent.
Thank you. I agree with everything that you've said. Assemblymember Prince.
Thank you. Good morning, both. In your report, I think it's page 217, I'll read it out to you, don't worry. I think you'll remember the phrase anyway. You refer to a dysfunctional relationship that's developed between the Met and Mopac. I just wondered, you know, sort of how long do you think that dysfunctional relationship has been going on? Why do you think it's occurred? And could I also, just in the interest of time, ask how did you find cooperation from the Mayor's office in general and the Mayor himself?
I don't have any idea what time it is, and as you can see, I can talk for bloody Britain. We're running late.
So yes, if you could be a bit...
What time is it now, just so I know how dreadful I'm being?
It's 10:02. But you're not being dreadful.
Oh, no,
everything you're saying is interesting.
Well, you know, when you've done this thing for a year and you really care about it, it's impossible to not want to get it 100% right. I'm conscious that I'm before you and I need to get every answer right, as it were, because the stakes are quite high for all of us.
Now, if we could go on just slightly over, then we'd be so grateful, because we've all got questions that we're dying to ask you.
So,
thank you.
Look, this is Fresh Start territory, and, you know, I think you're part of that Fresh Start. I think Mopac's part of the Fresh Start. I think the Mayor's part of that Fresh Start. But the biggest Fresh Start has to be for the Met. So the Met have a culture of defensiveness and denial. I mean, you know, let's be honest about it. There's no which way around this. Well, where do I start? So the idea that under the old Met, and I think it's not just the last commissioner, but the previous commissioner, and it just has this culture, you know, the biggest, bestest in the world, nothing's wrong here, nothing to look at here, it's just a bad apple, it's not a culture, it's not institutionally racist, it's just systemically racist. There's this culture, isn't there, of not just owning where you are. And they are almost impossible, as Assembly Member Russell has said, to get information out of. So it's like a clam that's closed over. And in a way, the more they're under attack, which is how they have seen it, the more they clam over. So I would say, I would caricature, and I have done in the report, that almost like this seesaw has got to stop. So the Met won't give MOPAC information. They'll give them loads of information. I mean, countless bloody reports that go on like that. I mean, it's soul-destroying. Thank God I didn't have to do some of this myself. You know, long on information, short on candour is a culture within the Met, and possibly, dare I say it, in policing more generally. You're not the only sort of equivalents of PCCs that are trying to get this out of things. And, you know, one of the things that I found so illustrative of this, and we were trying to get our heads around it, is, you know, stop and search is a pretty totemic issue, isn't it? I mean, it's, you know, whether you agree with it, disagree with it, think it could be better, think it could be worse. This is London. We do it a lot, and we do it a lot to black people. So we then looked at the kind of really straightforward thing here is, like, wouldn't you look at having a project that just did an overview of body-worn video? Well, to be fair to MOPAC, they have spent since 2018, asking a really simple question, which frankly you could ask, which is, you could ask MOPAC to do this for you, which is, could we do could we just have a look at, or get somebody independently to just review a load of body-worn video when it comes to stop and search? I mean, where's the harm in that? That's not anybody's operational independence. That's like me coming in, but in a mini version that would actually say, yep, do you know what? They do this right in most of the situations. Actually, they get this wrong. That's since 2018. To be fair, Mr. Prince, it's very mixed at borough level. It's very, very mixed. I can literally bore for Britain on this. It's done in very, very different ways at borough level, and it's done in a way where they pick the people coming in. The people coming in are not people that are necessarily able to scrutinise beyond what's lawful. So there's a real culture of saying stop and search is justified by being lawful. That's a very different thing to whether stop and search is being done well. And actually, it's another example of the Met doing show and tell. So, sorry, I don't know. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of another example where instead of just going, because some of the times they'll be getting things right, everyone. It's like, you know, not everything they do is terrible. Some people do stop and search well. But instead of that, they have this clammed over approach. And that's what's dysfunctional. And until they open it up, I can't then say whether HMI are doing their job properly, whether IOPC are making their judgments effectively, whether you're able to hold them to account effectively, frankly, whether the mayor is or the deputy mayor. And that's why I'm saying now is the moment for change, because it's dysfunctional at the moment. Who do I, on balance, sort of apportion the responsibility for that to? The Metropolitan Police.
Okay, thank you very much. Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. And could I add my thanks, Baroness Casey and Ms Kincaid, for the incredible work that you've done, and to your teams as well. Baroness Casey, your review talks about what could happen if sufficient progress is not made at various review points. And you seem to be suggesting that the Met is standing at the last chance corral at the moment. Over the next 2 years, and 2 years being the first review point that you're suggesting, what do you regard as sufficient progress? And secondly, you've talked about 2 years and then a 5-year review. Why 3 years between the first review point?
Because I think it's important to give the organisation time to breathe and time to change. I think that asking people to change something that is so deep set into policing, let alone into the Metropolitan Police, will take time. And so I think it would have been wrong, and I've been gently cautioning the new commissioner not to say he can solve everything immediately, that actually we are going to be in a situation, he's used these words himself, that every week, every month, and probably for a while, there will be pretty tough misconduct cases or criminal cases that go into the public domain, in part because in 2021 they set up their own version, this is a good thing they did, of a sort of special team to target sexual offenders within their own organisation, and that's what's bearing the fruit that you're seeing right now. But I don't think we can say clean-up should take forever. That essentially, if you think about it, just I'm sure many of you work in your own organisations, that actually what we find with the misconduct system is two things. First of all, at the outset, I'm not sure that everybody's clear, pre-vetting, during vetting, in training, about what ethical standards in the police are and what consent means. And consent isn't about being lawful when you stop and search. Consent is making sure people understand why it's happening and give you permission to do it. We give permission to the police to stop me, to search me, to handcuff me, to arrest me, and to keep me in a custody suite for 24 hours of the day. And I give them that permission on the basis of my consent. So the stakes around sort of the starting point of ethics, and again, you're in a world of College of Policing doing ethical good practice, somebody else having some more good practice here, good practice there, good practice everywhere. Let's just get the ethical standards in place. Let every cop know what they are. You know, less good practice, more determination. We don't need another document telling us what good practice is. We kind of know it, so why don't we just make sure it's bloody clear? Why don't we change our vetting process so people know if they fall fair of it, we will come for them. So I don't think they're sufficiently clear about the standards in the first place. Then when you've made those things clear, you need to make sure that your vetting, your recruitment, your vetting, your training gives you every standing possibility to root out problem makers. You also have an organisation that's 45,000 strong. At the moment, you don't believe people who are black or women when they come forward and make allegations. In fact, you do the opposite. Change it. And so I don't think you can say to an organisation where the stakes are as high as they are, because I give them consent to police me, you've got, 10 years, 5 years to sort out your misconduct system. Because you should see a massive rooting out, frankly, in the next year, 2 years, and then you should see it settle. And actually they could employ specialists that could do a lot better job of organising that for them than I am. But I do think that we need to clean up the Met. It's happened previously, back in the decades of other commissioners, and I think this is the time, if he does nothing else, he has to clean up the Met. And that won't make him popular necessarily with everybody, but it is absolutely the right thing to do. If I have to trust a police officer or have confidence in them when I am sexually assaulted or they're stopping and searching my son, they have to have standards I can trust. So I think the clean-up thing has to happen pretty quickly, and I don't want to say you've got 5 years to do that. So the clean-up thing, I think they should be determined and they should get it done. I also think the issue about how you reconnect, how you rebalance, how you re-earn the trust of black Londoners is so vital. It's so on the floor. The trust and confidence has been on the floor for a long time. Now it's been joined by women. Now it's been joined by white people. Therefore, it's become a much more mainstream issue. Let's go back to the root and sort out that first and foremost. We don't need to be in this place, in this country, with black Londoners. And then finally, I think the other thing that will be a test for me is when those officers have decent places to put specimens. And I'm not the first person to have found that. HMI did. And also when we've got, a good specialist teams that have in place learning that actually they could take from elsewhere in the country, but they're reluctant to. This new lot won't be. So actually we get a much better service for women who are raped, who are sexually assaulted, and people, 50% of their child abuse detectives have not been on the advanced child abuse training. These things don't take 5 years. Those things take a shorter period of time. So I think he could set himself in a reform plan We don't need to impose it. We've given some ideas in the report about the type of indicators we would look for if we were trying to respond to our review. Their recommendations, I don't want them watered down, obviously, but they could own that themselves and work out what their indicators would be. And wouldn't that be amazing, particularly on the race one? That you reversed the number of racists in your organisation, you meant the experience of cops in the organisation, instead of being the words used about them, it goes down, you sack the people that use them, that you rebalance your misconduct system, which we know is so unbalanced, and that's not an impossible task in 2 years. And you had a different dialogue with London, where actually black people and non-white people's confidence in the police would be at least a little bit restored. Wouldn't that be an amazing achievement for the new Commissioner and a new Met? And I think that's what we should get behind.
Yes, it would, Baroness. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Could I just add to that? Just one very briefly. In terms of when they come back in a couple of years, I think it would be very important that it's not other police officers that are doing that, and that it can be civilians who decide whether it's good enough for them as well.
Yes, I think we all agree with that as well. Assembly Member Devenish.
Good morning. You spoke about earlier public sector consultant versus doer. Now, MOPAC is a very large organisation at the moment. Do you bluntly think that some of the tens of millions from MOPAC could be moved into the Met to have more doers and less overseers?
I didn't review MOPAC, so I don't know the answer to that question. I do know that if you look at PCCs around the country, including Conservative PCCs, they do have people that support them in that work, and in the much more direct relationship between those PCCs and chief constables, there is a much, in some cases, more open way of kind of being accountable and giving information. You've got a pretty tough situation here, which is the previous Met commissioners and the organisation do not share information in an open and candid way. So I'm not going to criticise MOPAC because I see no reason to at the moment. They've been, to be honest, you have to remember that Baroness Nuala alone couldn't get her report out for 12 months because the Met didn't want it to go public and they refused to be engaged. I mean, that doesn't help anybody. And I'm also, to be honest, I don't want to get into some political battle between the Conservatives and Labour. I think that we've got to get behind the change needed. That includes the relationship with this committee, includes the relationship with MOPAC, the Mayor, but most importantly, and the Home Office probably as well, this kind of pull between somebody at 2 Marsham Street and somebody at City Hall. Let's just all try and get behind the Mayor.
Thank you. And in terms of the BCU model...
And the Commissioner, sorry.
Thank you. In terms of the BCU model, you've been quite damning about that model today. Do you think we need smaller BCUs going forward?
So, if I could wave a magic wand, I would reverse the decisions that were made 2014, 15, 16, and I wouldn't have, in some cases, such huge BCUs. When cops can't drive from one end of their BCU to the other without it taking ages, it's a worry to me. I don't think that's the top priority right now. If I'm honest, I would have put it in my report, Assembly Member, if I thought it was. My preference would be that over time that they did do some restructuring that made sure that there was a more direct connection. I don't think it's a priority for now. I think it's much more a priority that they are able to give information, explanation with candour and transparency to people like yourselves and your equivalents, as leaders and chief executives at borough level. And that's really what I want to change in the immediate months to come. At the moment, if you're a leader of a local authority or the chief executive, you're sort of a bit done to by the Met, as opposed to with. And I think that's a cultural change that's needed. So you get a call when you're needed. Otherwise, in peacetime, nobody talks to you. when there's a problem, the phone goes off the hook. That's across the political divide. I've got relationships with many leaders in London. And so I think, to be honest, that would be my starting point.
Okay, I'll leave it there, Chair. Thank you.
you very much. Assembly Member Duval.
Thank you very much. I welcome your report, and I think it is timely, no matter how difficult it is about some of the changes that had already been identified. I think your report gives added value to this process that we are in, whether we like it or not, or how uncomfortable it may be. So, for me, it causes me to reflect on actions in the past that I might have been involved with or not, and thinking about some of the issues today. What I am taken with is some of the recommendations here have actually all been before this committee in one form or another, and we've reached some of the same conclusions. So I think it's interesting from different avenues, and I recognise yours is an evidence-based report. The drivers have changed. You rightly focus on what the Met should do itself. And of course, we know externally there are some government changes that need to be made, not only government can make, around some of that to spur on the Met to do that. Equally, one of the other drivers that you promote within the report is the police board and the quarterly meetings of how you see that working. Of course, we need to reflect whether we need to change or not. In terms of how we do our work, we're not immune from this issue as well, but primarily it's the Met that needs to change in the way it carries out its business. So what role do you see, or could you foresee, about the role of this committee, but also could you just build on a little bit about how you saw the police board working in driving that change and oversight arrangements? And on the MOPAC issue, I don't necessarily see it as a political issue. I mean, some may want to make it a political issue, but surely we should be considering whether we review the MOPAC issues not in a positive way. Reviews always send bad things, but actually your report talks about actually out of some difficulties, inconsistencies, bad practices, discrimination that goes on, you can do better, you can make things better. So in that sense, I take it from that maybe we should be reviewing about how MOPAC works. I was very much taken by what you said in the report about MOPAC not being given the information. I just don't understand that. I don't understand that. I don't understand how reviews can be denied information as well, and that's stymie, and that's got to stop in some ways on the way forward. And the Met has got to make that decision that it's never going to engage in those tactics ever again.
So thank you very much for that question, and thank you actually for what you said about all of us needing to reflect our own responsibilities. And to be honest, I've been a public servant in this space for a long time, and it's given me cause to think about, when I was in the Home Office and those sorts of things, the ASBOs are, you sort of think, oh God, do we get that? I was critical of accountability and what did I say and what do I think? So I think it's important that that's very much the spirit with which we come at this too. I mean, I think that my view is that too much is marked within. So you have a management board in the Met, which isn't really a board in the way that we would think it's a board. It's not a sort of, it talks the language of ExCo as if it's a company, and it's not. I think Mark Rowley is trying to sort of shake that down and make that much more of sort of management, senior leadership management of the organisation. Then their turnaround board, of course, is actually people who are largely from within the system. And partly the turnaround board is to meet the responsibilities that they have to HMI, FRCS, the HMI, and I'm too old. And it's their way of managing sort of the engage issues, which of course are not the same as special measures. I keep trying to explain to the BBC special measures do not exist in policing, and that is not what the levers. There are no levers in policing. none in the way that there are in other public sector organisations, and that's, I think, one of the big issues that falls out of this report. And so I think that what I talked to the Mayor about was, and I mean, he got there ahead of me, actually, if you think about the sort of Transport for London board. But what we need is something that, again, is we've prized it open, keep it open in a positive way. This is now supporting the changes needed in the Met, not knocking them over. It's, you know, the report actually lays it bare, says what the diagnosis is, gives people a way to have hope and change. You know, it can't be any bloody worse than this. So actually, you know, the only way is up as long as you do it properly. Fake change is the worst type of change. So if you're going to make change, do it properly. Do less, get it done properly, right throughout your system. And so I think part of that is actually having a different type of board, which, again, brings outside people in. And it could be representatives from here, it could be representatives from different parts of the world outside, it could be people that understand what, you know, oversight is, it could be a specialist in race, it could be a specialist, you know, what he needs to create as actually the PCC for London is a much more open board. And I think when we use the word scrutiny, it shouldn't be seen as a negative thing. It should be seen as a, how can I get behind you and problem solve? And that's why I think I wanted, you know, again, a fresh start. All this is about saying to the world, let's have a fresh start. Let's acknowledge our problems, reach in and understand them, and work out what's next. So I think the new London Policing Board should be a board that has quite heft to it, deals with strategy and how strategy is enacted, hopefully takes what we have done here, let it be sort of operationalised by the police and then held to account in a very different way than this. People come before you and have a line to take, or MOPAC can't prise them open. Let's just try and jump over that to a world where we're actually just trying to be open and direct and honest with each other. And I think that's why, Len, I just thought that this was a different way of doing it. Yep. You know, you don't always have to criticise the past to suggest a fresh start is needed. You don't always have to diagnose everything and review everything. You can just jump, you know, now we know what matters more is the service to Londoners and how we get that right. And all we need to think about when it comes to structures is what structures that you're democratically elected to hold and to hold the police to account for actually enact that change you need on the street. So I think that's very much where I've been coming from. This is not a knocking report. This is an opening up report, allowing people then to see what it is that they think should change. And that's very much where I've come from it.
Lovely, thank you. Well, we've got to the end. I know each and every one of us has got loads more questions we'd love to ask, so perhaps another time we could ask you to come back. But certainly I think we'll all take from this, we have all got to work together to make sure that we end up with a better police service, one that we can all be proud of and one that we all assist with, quite frankly, because we cannot do without a good police service. So thank you very much to our guests for attending the meeting today and answering the committee's questions. We're going to now adjourn for 5 minutes before we welcome our next guest.
Chairman, may I just thank you for having us today and being so open to the type of answers and the discussion that we've had. And I feel so strongly, as I publish this report, I just want to mention the fact that my review was commissioned in the light of the abduction murder of Sarah Everard, and it's bookended by the multiple rapes of David Carrick with Mina Smallman's girls, which is the way we can only think of them. They were girls to her, though adults to the rest of us, that police officers that were there to be our guardians of their bodies. That was their job that night. They stand for all of us to do the things that we might find difficult. And they were the guardians of her children that night, and they took photographs. And so I just feel that whatever you do as we go forward, and, you know, I will step out of this at some point and try and see if somebody else will give me something else to do. But we have to hang on to the fact that the stakes are so high, and that's why getting this right is so important, and that's my final request, really, before you see Mark and Sophie.
It
Thank
is
you.
important getting it right. It's also important for, say, the parents of serving police officers who know that their lads and lasses go out to do their very best. So for everybody's sake, we need to get this right. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'd now like to welcome our guests for the second part of this discussion. Sir Mark Rowley, Commissioner of the Police of the Metropolis, and Sophie Linden, Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime. Good afternoon, both of you. Sir Mark, would you like to say a few words before we start?
Yes, I would. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Committee. And as I think I heard Baroness Casey say during her evidence to you, it's sort of worth reflecting before my comments, both on the people and the incidents that trigger this event, and this review that was commissioned by the Meta sort of just over a year ago, most notably, obviously, the murder of Sarah Everard, and also, and that sort of talks to the duty we have to Londoners to be so much better, and also the duty we have to police officers who give their best, which is illustrated by today being the anniversary of Keith Palmer's death 6 years ago. And I think those, I don't make any equivalence between them. I just use them simply as exemplars that this is really serious about the best of our people in an organisation that is not as good as it needs to be in terms of serving Londoners, and some awful incidents have illustrated that. Baroness Casey's report is profound and it's very important. This is a critical moment for policing, and we welcome this report. I welcome its findings. It must act as a catalyst for police reform. You have heard me from day one talking about police reform and the need to renew policing by consent, and Louise adds further colour to the cause of that and further insight on steps that we could take to make a difference. I've already apologised to the people of London and those in the organisation who have let down, and I've repeated that over the last couple of days, that I do recognise that. And this report, I think, does three things, if I try and be very broad on something that's very deep and profound. It calls out discrimination in the organisation, not just about the individuals, the racists, the homophobes, misogynists, but also the systemic failings within it, the management failings and the cultural failings. Secondly, it talks to a culture which isn't sufficiently orientated to looking at what we deliver from the perspective of the victims and the communities of London. And thirdly, it talks to a workforce of a majority of good, passionate, vocational people who don't feel set up to succeed. It talks to those three themes in very rich and vivid picture, and I welcome the findings and hope it acts as a catalyst. My second point, I think the different type of report this is makes it all the more powerful. Louise and her team have worked very hard to pull out individual testimony accounts, and I think the emotion in the report, and I use emotion in a sense of as a positive sense, the emotion, the personal testimony makes it all the more powerful. And having had 3 weeks to digest different iterations of the report, myself, my senior leaders, we've been through a bit of a roller coaster of emotions. You sort of anger, frustrated, embarrassment, upset, all the things you would imagine. More positive emotions, it sort of redoubles your intent and your resolve. I return to policing because I believe in reform, and it redoubles that. And also it adds to my pride in the majority of our people, because they step forward and they've called this out, and that's very powerful as well. So let's hope we can all find a way that this becomes a shared lever for reform. As Louise was saying earlier, I can't wait to do things. I have to get on and start to move things on. So we published our turnaround plan. So our analysis and plans are already shaping. You've fed back to us, which is very helpful. A lot of the themes are similar, and that's not to sort of decry Louise's insight. That's really important. And so we always said there'd be a version 2 of that. So we've got to absorb over the next few weeks the weight of Louise's thinking, feed that into our thinking. We'll get our version 2 will be all the more profound and serious for it. So we're on it. We have momentum. We're building that momentum, and we welcome the sort of additional thinking that can make it more profound. Fourth, I think it's helpful that the report calls out external factors, sort of funding, governance, growing demand, both growing proper demand and growing demand that is overflowing from other agencies that shouldn't be ours. Those are all relevant to these problems. But we mustn't use them as an excuse. The core of this is on us, and it's on us to fix. My last point returns to the sort of, I think the point for me about all of this is about galvanising. I and my new leadership team, we are galvanising the Met. We're trying to bring other people in to help us. We need this report to be galvanising beyond us. This isn't my police force. This isn't our police force in terms of, I know, myself and Lynn Owens or myself and the top team or even the whole organisation. It's our police force in terms of London. That's the idea behind policing by consent that I've been speaking about and Louise has spoken about as well. So it needs to be collectively galvanising, and in fora like this where you're going to be sort of rightly sort of upset and probing, we need to be sharp about how we do this so it galvanises in the right way and sort of doesn't become about pillory and blame of the good majority, but becomes properly about galvanising the organisation, its leaders, partners and others to come together around police reform. And that's what I hope this can be. Thank you.
Yes, I'm sure we all do. Thank you. Deputy Mayor, would you like to say anything?
Thank you very much. Just to add to what Sir Mark Rowley's already said, I mean, this report, I'm sure everybody who has managed to read it, and it takes time to digest, I do think it's a watershed moment for the Metropolitan Police. It's incredibly powerful and I wasn't shocked by it, because I think to be shocked you have to not know what's happening and it all has to be new, but what is within it really is quite appalling. And I think many people who you have been working with and we have been working with will feel validated by this report. Many of the officers and staff within the Metropolitan Police feel validated because what they have been talking about for a long time is now evidenced, and there are the case studies within the report. And many communities will also feel validated because they have been saying for a long time that there are significant problems and failings within the Metropolitan Police. It is a difficult moment, and I do want to say, as Mark has said as well, we mustn't forget the many brilliant, professional, dedicated, committed officers that are within the Metropolitan Police. Yesterday, when I was walking to City Hall through Dalston, about 7 o'clock in the morning, I saw a police car literally do a U-turn on Kingston High Road and put their blue lights on. And it really just struck home for me what policing is for London, as we all know, that even with this report being published, there were frontline police officers putting their blue lights on and going towards an emergency to support and protect and help Londoners. And we've got to remember that there are a lot of professionals within the Metropolitan Police that do that every day, day in, day out. We also need to thank those victims, those officers and staff within the Metropolitan Police who have spoken up, who have bravely spoken up. And we must remember the victims and the communities of London who have not had the service that they deserved in London. And as Sir Mark has talked about, it is of course the anniversary of Keith Palmer's death today. A moment of absolute bravery that we know that many officers often put their lives on the line to protect us. With all that, this is a moment for change. This is a moment for urgent change. Myself and the Mayor will do all we can to support and challenge the Metropolitan Police, support them in a difficult journey ahead, support them for the changes that are needed, and not just in the delivery of the recommendations, but actually in the overarching recommendations around changing the culture, improving the performance and improving the management of the Metropolitan Police. And we will challenge them as well in terms of ensuring that they're held to account, and that accountability and transparency that is needed for Londoners is delivered as well.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I mean, in reflection on what you were saying, you said you weren't shocked. I was deeply shocked. I know there were slight issues. I had absolutely no idea that the issues were this deep. If you weren't at all shocked and you knew about it, how long have you known that it's as bad as it's portrayed in this report?
So I use the word, I think the word shocked often means it's total news to you, and it's, absolutely comes out of a clear blue sky. Clearly this did not come out of a clear blue sky. The Mayor, after the murder and rape and abduction of Sarah Everard, the Mayor asked the previous Commissioner to commission this report because he had come to, and I had come to the end of the road in terms of the oversight and accountability and the real need to ensure that there was, a light shone in every part of the Metropolitan Police. and also the Mayor ensured that it was Baroness Casey that was there to conduct this review. So in that sense, we were waiting for this report. We knew from our own oversight boards and the work that we've been doing that there were significant problems. So, for example, 2016 and 2019, an in-depth study on misconduct carried out by Evidence and Insight, and also referenced in Dame Louise Casey's report in November, showed the disproportionality and misconduct. We knew there were significant problems there. We knew there were significant problems in terms of public protection. The London Rape Review of 2019 showed what was happening to victims, and we, have spent a lot of time analysing the figures around detection as well. And as you will know, Operation Soteria, which is a significant national programme to change the way in which rape investigations are carried out, it came about because we put aside significant MOPAC officer time as well as funding to ensure that that could happen.
Okay, well, I'm sure we'll come back to that. So Mark, if you look at the findings, is there anything in there that you think you can do quite quickly?
So I'm cautious about answering that simply because I don't want to sort of give a glib answer that suggests that we can fix all this rapidly. This is a massive piece of reform. But what we're going to do, we're going to demonstrate to Londoners step-by-step improvement as we work with them to improve things. So some of the examples I pull out about what we've done so far or things happening at the moment. We have been putting a lot of focus on our investigations in terms of rape and other offences, and I think we're detecting something like 200 more rape cases, solving 200 more rape cases this year than last year. We're making progress on solving more indecent exposure cases, for example, just to use those, and we're in the next few weeks we're launching an approach where we more proactively go after the top 500 predatory offenders in London, men who prey on women and children. So there would be one series of examples. We are stop and search rate. Stop and search is still productive. It's still contentious with communities. We're building a new approach, which we'll launch in the next few months, where we want to try and deploy stop and search more in collaboration with communities rather than doing it to communities. So where we see a surge of crime that we think generates an intensity of stop and search required in an area, to deploy that in consultation with communities rather than unilaterally on our decision. So we're making multiple steps with some of those plans that are there already. Those are some of the examples. I think on the standards and behaviour issue, which is one corner of the report that we've put, and we've spoken about that before, I will be publishing some data in the next couple of weeks, which I promised to at the end of March in terms of the reviews we're doing. That will show that our dismissals, for example, have gone up quite sharply, and suspensions, number of investigations, the amount of reports coming from officers is going up, so you can see progress on that. And we're also testing a sort of different legal route to remove officers who we think no longer pass the vetting standards, which is something that hasn't been done in the past. So removing the hundreds of people who shouldn't be here is clearly a part of the solution, and you will start to see progress on that in my next update, as much as setting up the vast majority of good people with better equipment, better resources to do that.
Okay, the Deputy Commissioner found out through means that there's 8,800, I think, officers, and you referred to it, I think, in our last meeting, that are actually on restricted duties or whatever else. Is this a main thing for that? Is it mainly sickness? Right.
So once Lynn gets her teeth into something, she will succeed on that. There's a whole mix of things in there. Some of that is a large number of recruits, and they are notionally on the strength of local units when actually they're at training school. So some of it is that abstraction. Some of it is proper serious issues of disability or injury on duty where people need properly redeploying, but we haven't always found the right role for them, which means they're not being used to best effect. Some of it is people who are under misconduct investigations, and we should be faster at dealing with them and either deciding they're fit for serve or they're not, or they're not fit to serve. So there's a range of factors in there. But the thing is, it adds together, and that abstraction takes a load off the front line. So we're trying to work through it so that everyone can be meaningfully employed. There's also been, because of the pressure on numbers, there's been a tendency to create posts above and beyond those that we've actually got funding for. And so those temporary teams effectively create abstractions again on the front line. So I think the point that Louise Casey makes in her report, which is exactly right on this, is that the orientation of where resources sit isn't enough focused at local level on sort of boroughs and BCUs. It's too pulled towards Scotland Yard. Yeah. The most important, a message I'm giving internally in terms of our thinking, we've got to flip what I see in the organisation too often, where it becomes organisational concerns come first, the front line comes second, and communities come third. And clearly that's inverted. And it's easy for a big bureaucracy to slip into that because of all the complexity of its size and policies and all of those sorts of issues. But that's clearly wrong, and it's not sort of rocket science, but flipping that round, so in every decision we make, actually, does this make sense for communities? Secondly, does this make sense for the officers who need the resources and frame of reference and equipment to be able to deliver a great service? And then thirdly, does it work from an organisational perspective? So it's flipping it round in that way is so important. And the way we allocate resources, which is the point of your question, Chair, is exactly on that point.
Okay, lovely, thank you. I'll move to Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Commissioner. Good morning, Deputy. Yeah, it is good morning. Good morning, Deputy Mayor. Commissioner, firstly, can I put on record for the umpteenth time the support of my Labour colleagues, but I think I speak on behalf of the whole committee, appreciation of the work done by the overwhelming majority of your officers. I think the Chair has also alluded to their good work, and I think that has got to be repeated time and time and time again, because I will have a question to ask you later about morale in the force. But Commissioner, just to put on record, do you accept and will you implement all the recommendations for the BET?
I accept the findings. I accept the spirit of the recommendation. Some of them are sort of written in headline terms, such as the effective disbanding of parliamentary diplomatic protection. We're going to do, and I've discussed this with Louise, the most radical reform possible in that area, and I think that meets the intent of her recommendation. I'm nervous about some of the words simply because I can't simply take away all the people and stop protecting embassies and parliament and that sort of thing. But the most radical reform in that space, before we've got new leaders, we've got new supervisors at the frontline level. I think a third or half of them are new. We're looking to bring in a different type of mix of officers. We're doing as much change as we possibly can do. And I think that adds together to her intent of effective disbanding. Though I'm nervous about other people's interpretation of the word disband, which is why I explain that. But the intent of Louise's report, I completely agree with.
In fact, I was going to ask you a question about the disbanding of the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Units. I was in Parliament yesterday, and I passed by some of the armed police officers. I was actually thinking about what Louise Casey has said. But is it too early to ask you what your thoughts are about a replacement unit or...
So I think the secret to this is about leadership. It's about organising whoever's doing the role, organising it well. One of the things we found in our own looking at that area is the shifts have been so organised and the different locations of work that actually it's made it very hard for sergeants to have much contact with their teams. So the way they're organised hasn't been effective to help supervision work. We have not been good enough at our ability to recruit firearms officers, so therefore the turnover in the department has been slow, and any department that doesn't have enough turnover can get stale, and that's a danger in there. So there's some quite deep systematic issues to deal with like that. We struggle to have as many firearms officers in the Met as we are resourced to have. And so there isn't a rapid solution to take, and I think about half that command is armed. There isn't a rapid solution to take everyone away. There isn't somebody to drop in behind them. But what we have to do is change the way we approach these things to do that. We've been doing some Deputy Assistant Commissioner Helen Millerchap was overseeing that area until recently. She's now into local policing. She's done some work, some really profound work to change the nature of people applying to it, and she's done some very clever targeted work that's bringing in a very large number of applicants who are much younger in service and much larger number of women officers applying, for example. And we're looking at the training and the qualifications, and if there's is there a different way we can set up the technicalities of the armed role that means we can train more people more quickly without losing standards. And so all of these technical issues come together so that we can create greater churn to have a different sort of fresh culture in there with new leadership at different levels, better organised. Some of their facilities, as Louise pointed out in her report, are pretty awful, and the speakers of Parliament are alive to that and making investments to help change that as well. So there's multiple parts of this that makes it a completely different environment.
So, Commissioner, something I put to Baroness Casey, that the change, what I call the change-resistant attitudes within the Met, which have frustrated previous attempts to reform. So, in what way are you confident that, quote, every officer and member of staff in the Met will step up to the challenges identified in this review, to accept its findings and commit to change, unquote?
They've got two choices. I'm serious about this. We're not sort of pussyfooting around these subjects. I see a resolve in most people that they are embarrassed and upset by this, as you'd expect them to be, and they want to change. The ones who aren't up for it will take on. Yesterday, the Deputy and I think we might have spoke to as many as sort of a fifth or a quarter of the organisation. We went out across multiple police stations. We did briefings. We connected those briefings sort of by video conference across the Met. There were some very reflective people. People get this. They're nervous about what this means for interactions with Londoners because they still want Londoners' support. But they get there is problems in the organisation. They know there's things that they can do on their teams to improve the culture. But as I've said, they also know that most of it sits with leadership and it sits with us to sort out, and we have a shared resolve. But the minority who, if they don't want to get on the bus, that's their problem. We'll sort them out.
So, Commissioner, earlier I think I referred to the issue of morale. I mean, how is morale right now? Because obviously, the Deputy Mayor talked about seeing a police car at 7 o'clock in the morning, blue lights on, do a U-turn, and go off to deal with the situation. And they're doing all this work, and obviously they see what's going on around them, read the papers, see the news. I mean, his morale presumably has been affected badly.
I think it's shaken. I think it's very finely balanced. We're an organisation at the moment which is 1,000 officers below its authorised establishment. Our projections for the next year are that we're going to the projections on sort of inputs and outputs, so to speak, in terms of recruitment and departures, suggest it's going to be probably the most optimistic is that we might only stay 1,000 light. Being 1,000 light, the government's policy at the moment is therefore they withhold the money rather than giving us the flexibility to spend it on other posts that help us strengthen the organisation in different ways. Obviously, like all other workers, they're hit by the sort of the inflation burst that we've had over the last year, on top of a 17% sort of real terms pay cut over the last decade. So pay's in there. Frustration with an organisation that isn't working in the way it ought to. So the things Louise pulls out in her report about not feeling they've got the equipment and the resources comes out. That's why I've been investing in mobile phones and technology for them, and just starting that journey of improving, but there's a lot to do there. And then wrapped around that is the debate of this, which is why I say, what I said earlier about it's hard to do, isn't it? But having a debate which is about being targeted about what's wrong, being really pushy about the need for dramatic reform, which you are and I am, but not letting sort of rhetoric turn that into something which may seem to be pillory or blame for the majority. It's quite a hard thing to pull off, but it's important. So there are multiple factors in this, but that morale is very precarious at the moment. But the people I sat in front of, they just want to go out and do policing. They're fantastic people. Yeah. When I was being interviewed by Sophie and the Mayor, I don't know, it seems a lifetime ago now, 9 months ago, whatever it was, and similarly by the Home Secretary at the time, Priti Patel, in those separate interviews, they both asked me about, there's obviously a lot of challenges, is this doable? Are you optimistic? And I'll say now what I said then. There are lots of challenges, there are lots of ways the Met needs to change and improve, but the reason we will succeed is the majority of our people, they really care. They go out there day in and day out and they do extraordinary things, and I see that some overnight sheets and there's examples of that overnight, and that will, they have the spirit to continue, and if we can turn, this is what I was saying to them yesterday, if we can turn that passion and zeal and determination not just to sort of fighting crime and building trust with communities, but also in becoming a better organisation, how we work together, then we can take on anything.
Yeah, just two questions, and I'll be brief, Chair. Commissioner, the review highlighted these cultural issues are long-standing, including long periods when you yourself were in senior management in the Met. Given experience, why would you say standards have slipped so dramatically over several years? And how much were you aware of the toxic culture in MO19 and the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Units that Baroness Casey highlights?
I've always taken on bad behaviour that I've seen as a senior leader. Clearly, in my I did 31 years in the Met in policing before I retired. I did my last 6 years in the Met, most of it in the Counter-Terrorism Command, which also includes the protection areas. I made changes there because including a Parliamentary Diplomatic Protection to try and improve it. I didn't see the richness and the vividness of what Louise has here, clearly. And I think what Louise has pointed out is the organisational radar awareness of this has been weak. And so it wasn't on my radar, and I wish it had been. And sort of, as Lynn and I have both said, having served in the Met at different times, you have to reflect on what could I have done differently to have spotted this. I've always tackled everything I've seen that's been a standards issue, but you look back and think, I wish I'd had a better radar, and what could I have done to have had one? We've got it now, and we're going after it.
Thank you. I'm going to stop you there. We'll come back if we have time.
Okay, Chair, fine.
Assemblymember Russell.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, Deputy Mayor, and good morning, Commissioner. I've got a question for each of you, and I'm going to start with the Commissioner. And I suppose also I just want to say, this session this morning with Baroness Casey really laying down a challenge to all of us in this room, both of you and all of us round this side of the table, to take this moment to reset everything, not only how the Met is run organisationally, but also how that scrutiny happens. And I just want to say I really look forward to looking at how we can address that challenge from Baroness Casey going forward. But, Commissioner, I just want to pick up back again on the term institutional racism. Now, you have rejected that term and said it's politicised. Baroness Casey was very clear this morning that she's using the Macpherson definition. She says she owns that definition, and she also said when people say something has become politicised, it's often a kind of way of saying it's become difficult. It's a get-out-of-jail card for difficult. And we also know that defensiveness and denial are two of the deep-seated cultures that Baroness Casey has found that need resolving. So my question is, for you, Commissioner, is how can Londoners have confidence that things will change? They want to see that defensiveness, denial being addressed. Now, I absolutely accept that you accept all the findings in the report, but I'm just saying that Londoners, they want to hear that they've been waiting decades for that institutional systemic racism in the Met to be seen and to be addressed. And I just wonder if you've reflected on whether you could use the word institutional systemic racism since all the comment and conversation yesterday on this.
I have used the word systemic. So just to be very clear on this, there is zero defensiveness here. I completely accept the diagnosis that Louise and her team have put on the table. The 4 points she talked you through earlier on, I completely accept those. I have, from last September, talked about systemic failings. So I've been really clear that whilst we have racists, misogynists and homophobes, this is not just about individuals. This is about systemic failings that create bias. It's about management failings. It's about cultural failings. So this is an analogy for me. This is about the body of the Met. It's not about a few bacteria that have got into the system. It's about the immune system has not been strong enough. So they're not the majority of cells, but they've got more of a foothold and they're having more influence than they ought to have done. This is about us systemically getting stronger to repel that from our system. So I completely agree with that diagnosis. As a police officer, I'm most focused on the practicalities of action and the things we're doing. I do recognise that words are important. The reason I've chosen not to use that word myself, I'm not disputing other people's right to use it. I'm not sort of trying to undermine that in any way. It's simply two things, though. One, it is an ambiguous term. In wider debate, it gets used very differently. A journalist yesterday picked a random definition out of the dictionary about institutional, which is nothing to do with the Casey definition or the Macpherson definition. Macpherson has one definition. Louise sort of rephrases it with 4 bullet points. I just need to be practical. And I think, for me, talking credibly as a leader, I get it's systemic, I get it's management, I get it's cultural, and we're going after it. That's why I've come to that. And also, besides being ambiguous, it has been a sort of a concept which sort of left and right have kicked around about its validity or not as well, and that doesn't make it any easier either. If I think something is the right thing to say, I couldn't care less whether it's whether Labour like it or Lib Dems or the Tories like it. I'll say if it's the right thing to say. But if it's also confusing, I can't go there. And I know a lot of people who don't take part in these sort of ethereal discussions that we have. A lot of people out there sort of instinctively think, well, that probably means most people are racist. Now, I know that's not what it means, but I think that's the danger of it. So it's simply...
Yes, I totally hear what you're saying. What's important is that... No, what's important is that Londoners hear you say that. Those Londoners that have been waiting for decades for the racism, the systemic racism, to be seen and to be acknowledged. Those Londoners need to hear that. And so the reason I've asked this question is because I'm worried that there are Londoners out there and Met officers who really need to hear that loud and clear. But because of time, I'm going to move on to my...
Can I just say, because you just used the word systemic, I'm absolutely accepting systemic. And then what we're doing about it, we're looking at how we deploy stop and search differently. We're looking again at promotion processes. We're doing all the sort of things you'd expecting us to do to dig underneath this and try and work out what do we need to do differently, because the last 20 years since Macpherson, whatever progress the Met has made, whether it's accepted labels or not labels, what we've done on the ground has not been enough, and it needs to be on my watch, and that's what I'm focused on.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor, just to go back to stop and search, and this comes back again to this relationship with Londoners, particularly Londoners who've been over-policed and under-protected. The Commissioner has said to me previously that stop and search is a power that has been overused and misused. I was really shocked to read about the work that MOPAC were trying to do with the Met to look into stop and search and review body-worn video, and to see that this is a project that had been trying to go on for a little while, a couple of years, I think, and that there was meant to be a meeting in February that didn't happen, and this was to do with a problem of coding of encounters, of stop and search encounters, and disparity in terms of how that was working. I've had the experience of waiting for months. I put in a question back last July about the locations of more intimate searches of children, and I'm still waiting for a response. It still says officers drafting a response. So I'm just wondering about this information about a power that is a huge power of the police that has a very strong impact on trust and confidence and on the way Londoners experience being policed. So I just wonder whether you feel that you have confidence now that you are going to be able to get that information that you need, and then that we'll be able to get the information that we've been asking for.
Thanks a lot. I mean, it's very clearly set out, isn't it, in Baroness Casey's report, the history of that study on body-worn video, which is, it shows the oversight that we were attempting to provide. Discussions first started in 2018. Within the Mayor's Action Plan in 2020, because we heard from communities, again, as we've discussed many times at the Police and Crime Committee, around the Mayor's Action Plan on trust and confidence. And again, a lot of the information in here has come from MOPAC surveys, such as the Public Attitude Survey and the Victim Satisfaction Survey. In terms of confidence going forward around the change, and I think it's not, don't want to just focus on data, although data is incredibly important and the transparency and accountability that brings. I have absolute confidence that has already been a change in terms of the way in which the relationship between MOPAC and the Metropolitan Police, our relationship. So it's not that I have confidence going forward, it has already changed. The new leadership is much, much more open, transparent to the oversight and accountability mechanisms of MOPAC, and I know that we are working with Mark to deal with some of the data. There are some technical issues around data that we do need to overcome because of the legalities of privacy and making sure that identifiable information isn't handed over to us, because that would be inappropriate. So there's some technical issues, but I have absolute confidence that there is a sea change, as Baroness Casey has talked about, a reset, a refresh, that is already happening in terms of that relationship.
Lovely. Thank you very much. You're out of time.
Thank you.
Sorry. I'm sorry. Everybody wants to ask you lots of questions. And I did hear Sir Mark use the word systemic several times yesterday. Before we come to Assembly Member Pigeon, just to put all the committee on notice, we'll go in reverse order. So after Assembly Member Pigeon, it'll be Deval, Devenish, Ahmed, Prince, Moema and Garrett. So I'll go over now to Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you very much. I have so many questions, but clearly I'm not going to get through them all today. But I'm listening very carefully to what you're saying, Sir Mark, and actually some of your answers, which I think would be my default as well, are initiatives that are going to happen, which are criticised in this report.
I agree with you.
Practical examples, actually the body language between the two of you, when you started listing lots of examples, Sophie sort of crossed her arms as if, here we go again. And what I want to understand is, this report talks absolutely about the culture, the way supervisors and managers have turned a blind eye to absolutely unacceptable behaviour throughout the organisation. This is ingrained behaviour. So how are you thinking about tackling that? Because that is much more, it can't just be, right, we reorganise these things there, we put another person there. What's your thinking? How are you approaching that, which is going to be the thing that shows whether you succeed or not in this space?
Yeah, and you're right to challenge me. I'm at the moment I'm stuck in that sort of middle ground of, I don't want to say I'm not doing anything at the moment. I'm just going to think for the next few months, because that would sound a bit wet, frankly, because that's not what's happening. There's lots that we are doing. But likewise, I don't want to imply a list of 6 things is going to fix everything. And that's the sort of conundrum, and that comes out in this conversation, and that's perfectly fair feedback. So I think the issue for me about culture is, at the moment, I look at it in sort of 2 parts, really. There's the enforcement piece, and then there's the prevention and strengthening. So it's much easier to see what you do with the enforcement piece, and we're getting tougher on that, and we've talked about that before. I'm not going to labour it, and we're looking for power so we can go faster and be sharper in that. And I think it may only be hundreds compared to the tens of thousands of good people, but actually the sooner you can move out the most toxic elements, the better. So that's a part of it, and I think that's important, but it's not the whole thing. So what's the sort of more preventative, positive side of developing culture? So we're looking at leadership development and training. In the police service across the country and in London, it has degraded quite significantly over many years. I've made a commitment that we're going to try and build the capability to do at least 1 week's, so 5 days leadership development per leader in the organisation each year. We're not going to get to that in one bound, and we're working with the College of Policing. The team are looking at sort of London sort of leadership and business schools. We're looking at community organisations in terms of how do we help leaders improve their skill set, both in terms of setting the right culture and also in setting standards when things get tougher and sharper. So that's sort of one big and difficult example that can't deliver overnight, but is a part of it. When I make comparisons to, I might have said this here before, but looking at leadership development and how underinvested we are, if you look at a military, I think a colonel's a decent comparison to a chief superintendent in the sense of they may be responsible for 1,000 or 2,000 people under their leadership. A colonel after Sandhurst will have had 72 weeks of leadership development. My chief superintendents, sort of since being an inspector, if they've had 5 weeks, they've been lucky. And sort of that's just indicative of the different weight and investments. And that's talking over 15 to 20 years of a career to go across those ranks. And so those things I think are absolutely important. We're also rethinking our values and how we inculcate and assess them. So our values at the moment talk to integrity, professionalism, courage and compassion. Of course, they're all good words, but they're quite a long way up here. None of them really capture collaborative. None of them capture, I know, the idea about listening to communities and sort of and that sort of idea about policing consent. And we don't yet have written down. So if I'm doing those or not doing those, what's the difference? And is that in my performance development review every year? And we're an organisation where 1 in 6 people are having a career review in a year, which is both about how do you set expectations in terms of performance and culture. It also plays out in staff surveys and goes to morale in terms of, you're not interested in my career. If you're not prepared to at least once a year for my sergeant or inspector to have a conversation with me about, you're really good at this, you're not so good at that, if we can work on this, what would you like to do next? The sort of things we all want in our careers. That's not so there's multiple strands of things we're looking at. And what we have to do is that work sort of is progressing, is take Louise's thinking, which is really very powerful, and make sure we've captured all of that. And some of her recommendations go to specific points on this, but some of her findings ask us to be far more ambitious. And I think Louise herself would be honest, say she hasn't found the whole prescription. She's got a series of findings and ideas which are good, but there's not the whole prescription there, and the onus is on us to find that and to work with you as you scrutinise it. So it's quite a range of things. So I can do some heavy lifting on the enforcement very quickly. The prevention and development is going to take time.
And I think you probably need to get some experts in.
Absolutely
who've worked
right.
in other organisations who absolutely understand what, a proper culture looks like. And when I read the examples in here, I think, how can anyone survive working in this place? I mean, how can anyone, with the constant obsession with sex, quite frankly, when I've read through this report, sexualisation, constantly asking officers about their sex lives, I mean, how can this go on in a modern workplace? I have no understanding of that.
And so just to give an example, a couple of years ago, a senior officer, this has been in the papers, and this is in this thing as well, I think, a senior officer decided not to dismiss somebody who had a criminal conviction for masturbating on the train on the way home from work. Yeah. Now, so what does that licence? What's the message that sends? Yeah. It's appalling. Yeah. Yeah. So I've got some legacy to clear up. But some of this is a commissioner just sets a very different tone, and we have to be ruthless on this. And it's not. The vast majority of my people have nothing to fear, and they know that, and they're as embarrassed and angry by this as I am.
But then some very practical specifics in here, very critical about the closure of police stations. Can you commit that you will not be closing any more police stations in London?
The estate is big and complicated. We need to be closer to communities, and one part of that is, you've heard me speak about sort of strengthening neighbourhood policing, which isn't just about, it's partly about a number of people, it's partly about making sure they're not abstracted, but it's also about a philosophy of policing that is the community matter. It's not just about a bunch of people over there, it's about everybody. Part of that is your local policing team ought to be able to walk to their patch. At the moment, our estate doesn't allow maybe around 10%, but so that's a very rough number. So don't sort of take me as sort of gospel. That's exact, but can't walk within 20 minutes to their patch. Now that's clearly we've got to sort that out within our current estate plan. So that's why I asked for sort of the developing estate strategy to put some new criteria in it. Sophie in the Mayor's office. So we're working on that, and that's coming forward, and I know Sophie in the Mayor's office is supportive of that work we're doing, and also eager to get the estate strategy on the table.
Okay. In terms of one specific,
briefly,
I appreciate some specifics in this report. The specialist units clearly acting, and you've already talked about some of that, but
yes.
This bit, we're told of officers making multiple frequent expense claims just below the limit that would require formal sign-off, travelling overseas for training courses, ordering iPads and personalised jackets on expenses. This reminds me of my time on the police authority when there was a huge scandal of credit card fraud in the Met, and we put in tough measures, and through the MPA, through monthly committees I sat on, to make sure we got that fraud down. What are you doing to tackle things like that? Because that's not just the sexual misconduct, whatever, that's just corrupt, actually. What are you doing to tackle that sort of issue within these specialist units?
So we're looking at the finances of relevant units, and there's just going down a slight tangent. There are lots of worrying case studies in Louise's report. They are, she took them on the basis from people they were going to stay anonymous. We've asked Louise for the evidence on those because we want to follow them all up, and if they stand up as they present, then there's lots of people who shouldn't have a job. But that needs proper investigation, and we've asked Louise for the starting point to be able to do those investigations. Some of them, like the finances, we can do the audits based on the records, and we can get to the bottom of it quite quickly. If it presents as it presents in the report, then obviously it's very, very serious, both in terms of individuals and then looking again at systems in terms of why have the systems allowed this to happen.
Okay,
thank you. Assembly Member Duval.
But the system should really stop, isn't it? I mean, one of the issues, the purchase of tomahawks, I can't think of any policing circumstances that would be appropriate. So I hope that's on your radar.
Absolutely.
In terms of that, and whether it's true or not, but someone needs to do it very quickly. Let's come to priorities, because some of this is going to take time. Some of this is going to be in your gift to do certain things. You said, I think one of the most important things is setting the tone and no mixed messages. And one of the things that worries me about, whilst I welcome the report, the messages that go outside to people that you're all rotten, actually we don't trust you completely, you've still got to do the day job, and you've got to reform yourselves, and you've got to do this change agenda. There is no ifs or buts about it, because this change agenda represents good policing and should be there as a matter of course. And you're right, you've acknowledged it, you're now in that pause, you've started the work, but you're now in a pause situation again, which you haven't got long to pause for and reflect because of Louise's report about where we are. So how do we avoid some of the mixed messages around those issues of what you're sending, not just to your sort of people internally in the organisation, because you rightly got to concentrate on that, but there's also messages to the public that have got to be honest, haven't they? So what's the strategy for that, and how are you going to prioritise some of the actions that you've got to do? Also, you're waiting on others. We need the government to change the system to make it easier for people to exit the organisation where they've done wrong. Due process, I'm a great believer in that, but where they've done wrong, there should be no place for people in our organisation of the Metropolitan Police Service.
So you identify very shrewdly the sort of the tension in this, because they sort of get on with stuff, think, get on with stuff, think. And so if I just pick one of the strands of work in our current turnaround plan, strengthening neighbourhood policing. The thinking on the detail of that, how we deploy the extra PCSOs, the new superintendents on boroughs, what it means for training and powers, how people operate, how we connect better to local authorities, that thinking is still developing, and I'm not going to hold that thinking up. That would be foolish. And Louise's report doesn't dispute that, I don't think, but then she's got some other ideas in there about actually you need to think harder about how you inculcate policing by consent. You think harder about what's your conversation with Londoners that deals with this this tension, this frustration, this lack of trust, this desire for a different way that policing works with communities. How are you going to have that conversation with Londoners? So, on the one hand, I don't want to slow down doing some of the basic obvious things in terms of improving neighbour policing. And so in parallel with that, we have to sort of start to work out actually how do we have a wider conversation, involve other people, and set up a sort of framework that does have that wider conversation with London that acts as a constructive force to create a different way that policing communities work together. And across all of our current thinking and the additional insight that Louise brings in, we've got to do that. And what I'm trying to avoid is I could sit back for sort of 3 or 6 months and say, I'm just thinking, don't ask me any questions. I don't think I'd last very long if I tried that, to be honest, but and I know you're not suggesting that. On the other hand, I can crack on and do things and ignore Louise's report, and that's equally dim. And I've got to try and get a blend between the two of doing sensible things. And the tone I'm trying to convey to the people in the Met and publicly is that we're on this in the sense of we're on the need for reform. We're on the idea of renewing policing by consent. I was saying that on my first appearance in here 6 months ago. We are on this, and on top of our own thinking, Louise Casey has added a whole load of extra insight. She's found some things that we haven't found. She's thrown some new ideas in it, and we have to mix that in. But I have to sort of mix that in, and I have to add those new components into the car whilst driving the car. I can't stop the car for 6 months. And that's the messiness of what I'm doing. And I don't I don't apologise for that. One last thing that I think is relevant to the whole conversation. I've done a lot of thinking and speaking to people from outside policing around big organisations that get into a bit of a corner where things are going wrong, and they start to go in the wrong direction. And that's why I was using the word turnaround, and sort of what's the way out of that? What succeeds and what fails? And I've spoken to people who've led that sort of thing. I've sort of spoken to experts who've studied it. I've sort of read sort of articles and books on it. And you have to set the right path out. You have to have a sense of, okay, here are the things to do. But it does come down to just relentless delivery, step by step. So you work out whether it's about culture, whether it's about improving service to Londoners, whether it's about better equipping the front line to do a good job. You work out the steps and you take one step at a time, and it's about relentless delivery. There is not one Hail Mary solution here. There's not one idea that's going to do it. So what I need to give that sense of is, step by step, we're going to tackle all these issues. We're absolutely serious. But the plan and the steps will be evolving as we're doing it, and that's the tension.
And with that plan, we're going to have a little bit of a timescale, a realistic timescale that doesn't say you have to deliver it by tomorrow, but realistically says when. We've already heard there's a review timetable that Louise has said, and that may flex in some ways, but we need to have some timescales, don't we?
Yes,
we need some issues. So will there be a reissue of the turnaround plan too, with some sense of when we expect to see some results or when we expect to implement it? Can I just take one of your strands very quickly, because the time is pressing.
Very quickly.
On neighbourhood policing, which I have some...
Which policing, sorry?
Neighbourhood policing, ward policing, we used to call it ward policing, whatever you called it this week, which I have some history with.
Yes.
Right, but in doing that, one of the missions is about mixed messages, isn't it? A number of senior officers in the Met described it as community engagement. I described it as operational policing. There were actually police officers who went out and arrested people that were causing bad things in our communities. That's really the Met solve that issue, because they're the starting points of some of the issues, the problems in the specialised units and some of these issues. And we still have a view from senior officers that it actually isn't real policing as such. Of course it's real policing. People sitting behind desks is real policing. The front line exists in many forms. So have we really got the philosophy about what we're trying to do, which is that protect people in society, deter crime, capture people that are breaking the rules? Have we really got clear about different aspects of the Met and their role within those situations?
If I can ask you to answer briefly.
So I am very clear. There are some mixed views in the organisation, but we're confronting those. Neighbourhood policing is not about kissing babies and holding hands. It's about fighting crime. But it's about fighting crime through the lens of how local communities see it, which isn't always the same as the statisticians see it. Yep. And it's about fighting crime with local communities and with partners. But it's still about fighting crime. And it's that collaboration, it's that listening, it's that collaboration, it's that joint action that is going to be the cornerstone of building trust. But it is still fighting crime, it's not kissing babies.
Thank you. Assemblymember Devonish.
Good afternoon, Commissioner, Deputy Mayor. Deputy Mayor, Baroness Casey says, and I quote, "The Met have in the past avoided scrutiny, holding MOPAC at arm's length, not sharing information and data. MOPAC, in turn, have not been able to provide the strategic oversight function that the Met needs." What are you going to do differently?
Thank you very much. I mean, I totally accept Baroness Casey's findings in terms of the relationship around governance, accountability and transparency. I think we've already set out what's going to be very different in terms of, and I listened to Baroness Casey's, while she was in front of you this morning, she was very clear that the really significant problem in that relationship was the way in which the Metropolitan Police was defensive, was not open, was not transparent, and was holding us at arm's length. So in terms of what is going to happen differently, I've already talked about the absolute step change and difference in the new leadership of the Metropolitan Police with Sir Mark and Dame Lynn in terms of that relationship. It is open, transparent and accountable, and we will continue to do that. I've talked about data. We've got a few issues to overcome in terms of technicalities of some of the data that we asked for, but I'm really confident that that will happen. So that will change. And in terms of the Baroness Casey's report as well, in relation to how we conduct oversight, we of course are thinking about what should we do differently in the future? What can we do differently? The policing board, London Policing Board, the Mayor will chair, and again that is in order to be able to talk about that fresh start in terms of the governance and accountability of the Metropolitan Police. We'll be working very quickly to put that board in place and ensuring that there are outside people on that board, outside experts on the board who can support as well as challenge the Metropolitan Police to change.
But you also have to acknowledge that you, in the past, must have been fobbed off. The Met may have been obstructive, absolutely, but you guys were asking questions and then not getting proper answers. Do you accept that you were fobbed off during much of the last 6.5 years?
So no, I don't accept that over the last 6.5 years we haven't done robust oversight. I've already named some of the actions that we've taken. Gangs Matrix was a difficult piece of work that we undertook from Evidence and Insight. We did not take no for an answer in terms of the data around that, and you know that over 1,000 people have been taken off the gangs matrix, and the reason we wanted to review the gangs matrix was because of the issues within this report around disproportionality of those that were on it. So in terms of some of the answers that we didn't get, we never gave up, we never stopped, but we didn't get the answer, we didn't get all the answers that we wanted.
Baroness Casey also spoke this morning about doers in government rather than just consultants. Do you think MOPAC needs to have more doers and less consultants in their approach to get what they need to get at in terms of working with the Met?
We are looking at our oversight and the capacity of oversight. I noticed earlier you talked about the fact that MOPAC was too big and that that some of our resources should go over to the Met, but you seem to be now suggesting we have more resources. Of course, the more resources we have, the more oversight we can do. You have to prioritise in terms of the capacity that you have, and that's what we have done so far. But of course we're looking, and I take with the humility that Baroness Casey has asked for us all to look at her report, the humility that we need need to look and review our capacity and how we prioritise the work that we are doing within MOPAC.
And very briefly, Commissioner, the one thing you said this morning, which again disappointed me, you talked about probably having at least 1,000 fewer officers than you're entitled to have, even in 12 months' time. Baroness Casey also talked about, she said, the police uplift programme has been a missed opportunity to improve diversity and the skills base of your workforce. Surely amongst Londoners, 8-10 million Londoners, you can find another 1,000 coppers from, I don't like using the word BAM community, but from the wider London community, so we haven't got 1,000 short next year.
So we are doing everything we possibly can do in terms of our recruitment and retention. We're looking very hard at it. But the London employment market is enormously hot. You look at all industries, all sectors are struggling. The sort of police pay of a frontline officer, comparable pay points over a decade has gone down by 17% in real terms. And now on top of that, we've got the sort of cost of living surge of the last 6 or 12 months. And then you've got sort of the challenges in terms of the reputation of the organisation. Those are the factors which weigh heavily on people. You add all that together, that's a very difficult mix. And I think some of that is for me to fix, and some of that politicians can help with.
Okay, as I said, I think I said at the last meeting, it'd be great to have a separate session on that because I think it's key. We can't sit here and talk about resources and money if you can't actually even get the resources on the front line. Because of, I appreciate the point you're making about the jobs market being great under a Conservative government. I'm sure my Labour colleagues would agree with that. Thank you, Chair.
There's also just one other point on that in terms of resources. If I had complete flexibility, I might choose a slightly different mix of police officers and police staff. And I'm not talking about just I'm not talking about back office roles. Yeah. Other police forces have a higher ratio, a different mix of police officers and police staff in operational roles, like in public protection, dealing with sort of rape victims, child abuse victims, etc. The current funding arrangements restrict me from picking the operational mix that I think is the most effective because of the levers around different recruitment targets.
Thank you. Well, hopefully, if you talk to Chris Philp, see what can be done. Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, panel. Commissioner, in the light of the review conclusions, do you think the turnaround plan, which is very welcome, however, in its present form, does it go far enough to address the crisis the Casey review has outlined?
I think I've been very clear it needs to come out with another version. And if you look at the forward in it in January, it says this is a first version because we want to crack on with things. We want to seek Londoners' view and we want to start building plans. But there will be another version that will take account of what we learn from that feedback and from what Baroness Casey said. So that's always been our intent. And there's some very strong and thoughtful proposals. There's some very deep analysis there, and that needs to feature as we've discussed.
So we talked about, and if you accept the recommendations, we talked about review deadlines. So the first review that Baroness Casey talks about is in 2 years' time. I'm going to ask you the question that I asked her. In 2 years' time, what changes will you expect to have seen within the Met?
So there will be particular ways you will see service to Londoners having improved. That has to be the most important piece. So the strength of neighbourhood policing and the local community's reaction to that, the quality of our response to calls, the success rate in our investigation of public protection offences, so sort of rape, indecent exposure, sexual assault, etc. So some of those key themes which are in the turnaround plan and come out very strongly in Casey's report, we will improve upon. I would hope in that time, though it's a much more finely balanced thing, that we can start to see some of those starting to register on trust and confidence measures, but those don't turn around overnight. But those practical steps should begin to affect that over forthcoming years. And then behind that, of less interest to the public but critical to delivery, I will be able to evidence, and we'll start evidence that in the next few weeks, how we've got much tougher and clearer in terms of standards and who is in the police and who isn't. We've got much better at developing our people, at training and developing leaders, as I said earlier. We've built we've repaired some of the foundations that Louise Casey finds are damaged in terms of human resources support for the front line, in terms of technology, other logistics issues. She calls out the fridges issue in her report. So all of those practical issues which we might be interested in here are important because they stand underneath the quality of that service that we see changing to Londoners. So it all starts from Londoners, but we have to look at the layers underneath it.
So with the trust and confidence issue, in 2 years' time, what do you want to be able to say and be absolutely clear has happened to restore Londoners' trust and confidence, or go a long way to restoring Londoners' trust and confidence in the Met Police?
So I would expect and hope that Londoners will have noticed community policing looks more real and stronger, that the response to calls and response to key incidents like reports of rape is better, and that they have increased confidence that we are serious about our own integrity and we've been ruthless about sorting out those that let us down. Those are the things I can deliver, and I would expect, depending on how it's reported, how it's discussed, how it's presented, how we communicate it, that to start to filter into London psyche. You think, actually, look, the Met's gone through a bad period, maybe it's coming out of it. So that doesn't happen overnight. I mean, you're politicians, you look at polls probably more than I do, and they're quite hard to move, aren't they? And once there's a sense that you're going in the wrong direction, all I can do is make those critical steps and show that we are succeeding, and I'm sure over time that will start to penetrate Londoners' views. Actually, this is now going in the right direction.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Deputy Mayor, as Baroness Casey said, we're all in this together. So I don't want to get reflect on what could, should, or may have been done. But two things really: the London Policing Board. You said the Mayor may well adopt that and go and run with that with these quarterly meetings. Is there going to be any sort of political representation on that? Is there going to be an attempt to actually have a balance of political views on that board? Do you know?
So we've accepted all the recommendations, within the report, and that includes the London Policing Board. So it will happen. It's not may well, it will happen. We're looking at the moment as to how that board will function. I think the key criteria around that is, what does the Metropolitan Police need in order for it to be able to really drive, for that board to support and challenge and drive change, and that will be the key criteria as to who needs to sit on it.
All right, I'll let you get away with that one. Then the other criticism in the summary, again, don't want to go into the criticism of it, is that MOPAC's relationship with the Mayor, with the Met, was sort of tactical rather than strategic. I don't know if you saw that, it's page 217. I just wondered what obviously you haven't had a lot of time to think about it, but how do you think the MOPAC going forward can be more strategic? Because ultimately I've always looked at MOPAC as being the strategic body with the police delivering the tactics and the day-to-day running, but the strategy being set by MOPAC. What do you think you and your colleagues and the Mayor can do to make MOPAC more strategic in its approach, and what changes do you think need to be made?
So that description in the report, I think the example of body-worn video and the barriers that we have faced in terms of a very strategic view, saying there is, strategically what is going wrong with stop, what are communities saying to us about stop and search, strategically what is happening. We need to look at the body-worn video to really understand, is there discrimination, is there racial bias within stop and search. But the tactical element that had to come out was, how are we actually going to get hold of that how are we actually going to get hold of that body-worn video? Now, I have every confidence that will be unlocked now, but that example shows you a strategic view, strategic oversight, and how you actually then have to go down into practical tactics to be able to do that. In terms of going forward, we have set out very clearly in the police and crime plan what our strategic views are, our strategic objectives are. We were really clear around, of course, tackling violence, including violence against women and girls, protecting victims, supporting victims, which again is within this report and also within the Engage process, but also trust and confidence being a key strategic view. So that we have been very clear about what we're doing going forward. And if you look on the MOPAC dashboard, you will see the oversight that we are undertaking, and you will also see how we are tracking progress against those strategic objectives.
And can I just flick that back to you, Sir Marcus, to clearly there was this dysfunctional relationship. What are you going to put in place to allow MOPAC to work more closely with the Met and to have a better relationship and to be more strategic?
I've been very clear with my team that we shouldn't be hiding anything from MOPAC. That's governance. We're professional police officers. We're accountable to politicians. That's how it works. There are almost no bounds on that. There's a practicality bound if the questions were just consuming too many resources, which isn't a problem at the moment. And secondly, there's just a personal data issue that it's right that MOPAC can look at everything we do, but it's not right that they can look at who we're investigating for what crime. But they should know what the crimes are and where they are, and MOPAC has no wish on that. So there's one little practicality barrier there. But other than that, we've got nothing to hide. And I think, frankly, I need their support and involvement. And if when we have conversations in the future about budgets or procurement decisions or strategies, they will be a better conversation if we understand each other. And if I'm only showing Sophie 1% of the hand I hold, then the conversation ends up being a second-rate conversation, doesn't it? So it's in my interest to be transparent with those very minor boundaries set on it.
Thank you. Assembly Member Moema.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm going to try and wrap up a number of things in a question, and you may want to answer some of them or all of them. But just to say that I completely echo, I try in the spirit of gentleness that Baroness Casey, talked about this morning, to allow space for the Met to do what it needs to do. I think it nevertheless is, whilst I can understand the rationale behind it, it is, I don't have the words actually, it's not disappointing, it's just deflating to kind of see some of that work around moving from McPherson to a point. If there are other words to be used to make sure that it happens, then that might be something that might be better, more forcefully expressed over the next few months. But I just wanted to put that on record. But the substantive question that I have is actually about the things which are not maybe the headline issues, but I think are really, really important and maybe speak to the way that we work here in the committee to, I think, more fully scrutinise. But they do relate to neighbourhood policing and the way that has been, it's the one bit of the police that has been defunded from the looks of things. There are figures which say that neighbourhood policing, frontline policing, have lost 80% of civilian staff. If I'm getting my terminologies wrong.
That's probably about right.
Yeah, but the overall cut in civilian staff is about 25% across the Met.
That's right.
So which means that there are vast swathes of the Met that have seen no cuts in their civilian support. And given that the BCUs, the PCSOs, all of those people are the bits that Londoners touch and rely on to keep us safe and to keep us harm away from us, but is the most under-resourced, unloved part of policing. You have at the other extreme, extreme is the wrong word, but the the boys' toys command, where the people have got guns and weapons and access to alternative ways of policing. And they are a little bit more present in neighbourhoods and communities like the one that I represent, and in some at a time where you'd rather be seeing neighbourhood policing than, for example, TSG rolling down the Kingsland Road on a Saturday afternoon. It would be far better to see beat policing, but we know that they're not available, so we take what we can get. But my question is really, in turning around and flipping that pyramid on its head around priorities, that seems like an obvious place to do it. But in terms of asking and including communities what they actually want from policing, I do think there is an opportunity here to make the future plan a lot stronger if those views are sought from as granular a level as is possible, rather than the police coming up with something and imposing it yet again on a community, and your solutions, though well-intentioned, don't resolve any issues on the ground. Because, Black Londoners, like other Londoners, want to be protected and not to be over-policed themselves. And that is something which requires a reset and requires a different level of engagement from a BCU in that circumstance compared to one which may be less ethnically diverse. But both are good policing for their communities. That's the first part of my question. The second part was around...
Assembly member.
I will get to it, I promise. The fire brigade, also Blue Light Service, who've got some serious issues, they talk about the training that they get from the same provider that was mentioned in Dame Louise Casey's report, Babcock. And there are also examples of consultancy that has not particularly generated much by way of output for the police to then go and use. And just want to have a think at a future date about the actual cost controls and the way in which money is spent for a positive outcome within the Met, and where that actually sits and where that's signed off.
Okay, I've tried to. That's quite a long question. Thank you. I think I've got three themes to put out, but I probably missed something. So, firstly, on the police staff point, overall, Baroness Casey's she's critical of a lot of the decisions that were made during austerity in terms of cuts and various other decisions. People obviously wrestled with it then and tried to protect the front line, and one of her conclusions is you were too tough on staff. So she makes the point we're too tough on staff across the board. So things like HR and other areas have been stripped back, and those foundations are damaged. We don't have enough analysts, so that plays into our ability to be focused. So she talks about those. But as you're right, she talks about neighbourhoods, and we are 1,600 PCSOs fewer today than we were a decade ago. And I've been discussing with the Deputy Mayor and Mayor about trying to rebuild that, and in this year's budget I'm pleased that we've got 500 extra PCSOs who we're recruiting during the course of the year. So that's a step back in that direction. The police officers we have on in neighbourhoods are, on paper, actually a comparable number to we had a decade ago between the neighbourhood teams and the town centre teams. But the reality is, with the abstractions and the way the resources are managed at the moment, the presence that is felt is not where it needs to be, and there are issues with the estates and other areas. So absolutely get the theme about neighbourhoods, and you're right, and about PCSOs, and you're right, and I'm keen to go there. People made decisions based on shrinking budgets, and I was part of some of those decisions, not other ones. They're all made with the best intent of trying to protect services the best they could. The community sort of reset, I wrote down here, in terms of that conversation with the community. So I think the PCSOs and the neighbourhood model is an indicator of, so how do you have that conversation? And the steer I've given to my team, and I'm sort of open to sort of other suggestions on this, is we need to come up with a rough idea about, well, broadly across 32 boroughs, this is how you might put the resources out there, and broadly this is how you might divide them between wards. Because you can't really start with a conversation like, here's all the resources in the middle, fight over them. Saying broadly we think this makes sense, looking at confidence data and crime data. But then before we sort of completely put a stamp on it, you have conversations with local authorities and communities and reflect on what they say. And I was talking to just to illustrate it, I was talking to one of the BCU commanders, and he was saying to me, one of the reasons we need to have these conversations is that crime data doesn't show it all. So he would say on his BCU, there are some wards where they're very insular, they're very untrusting of the police. And if you look at crime data, because they're reporting so low, it might not put them as high on the radar in terms of resources as him and the local authority would say. And I want the BCU commander and the local authority to say, actually, I know the data says allocate them that way, but we need to tip them a bit back. So I agree with that principle, and we just got to get that balance right. Lastly, going outside, as part of partly financial saving and partly looking for other expertise, there was a decision to go outside in terms of outsourcing, partnering with other organisations. I think probably some bits of those have worked and some haven't. And I visited the Babcock suppliers you mentioned, they coordinate the work done with the 4 universities in terms of training our new recruits. I visited one of those universities, and some of the things I found aren't good enough, and I've had quite a stiff conversation with the people involved. So we need to look at that and how we do it.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Assembly Member Garrett.
Afternoon.
Afternoon.
Sort of reflecting on sort of the conversations and the reading of the report, it's obviously it's a very emotional moment, and I think for a lot of people it's a moment of vindication and perhaps a moment of catharsis. What I'm concerned is that as that sort of moment, there's only so long that you can maintain, I suppose, that tone. And what I'm concerned is that the sort of the more nuts and bolts stuff, the process stuff, the mechanisms that actually solve these problems happen, and not just a great outpouring of emotion and then back to business as usual. Two things in particular have struck me from the report that I don't think we've sort of been touched on a bit but haven't quite been covered. One, she talks about sergeants and inspectors who are the sort of line managers of people who may be raising concerns, say officers who are concerned about poor behaviour of their fellow officers, and she says that they're so overworked that they don't have the capacity to deal with it. It's easier for them just to turn a blind eye, and you can do as much cultural change as you like, but if people don't have the capacity to do the actual nuts and bolts stuff of dealing with miscreants, then they will not be dealt with. So that's my first question: is what is the process to actually make sure those sort of team leader level people, sergeants and inspectors, have the capacity to do the work that we would like to see them do? And then secondly, about BCUs, and that they seem to have, so we've heard about how borough leadership is being cut out of the process of scrutinising and understanding what's going on with policing in their borough. We've also, I was a bit concerned as well, I think Baroness Casey was particularly talking about this earlier this morning, about how BCU commanders themselves within the Met get cut out of the process. So things happen in their patch, in inverted commas, isn't really their patch. They're sort of secondary to what's going on, and other things are going on. So they themselves aren't even in a position, even if they were actively dealing with their borough leadership, they may not actually have the answers. They may not be in control. So those are two things. One is how do you make sure that sergeants and inspectors are in a position to do the thing that we are all asking them to do? And secondly, what are we doing about borough commanders, BCU commanders, so that they actually are able to liaise properly with borough leadership and also are taken seriously within the organisation?
Both good questions, thank you. And they both sort of come to that, I think, flipping a mindset from the sort of community inwards rather than from the centre outwards. So the sort of frontline leadership is critical to this, and I say that in a constructive sense, not in a blame sense. There's a ratios point. We have more of our experience in the specialist commands and less on BCUs, particularly with the burst of recruitment recently, and yet we have much lower supervisory ratios in the specialist commands than we do on the BCUs. You can have and that is clearly wrong, and it has become a more acute problem because I guess if you're a sergeant supervising 12 people, that's pretty hard. If 8 of them are experienced and 4 are new, it might make it more manageable, or at least less unmanageable. If it flips the other way and it's, 10 are inexperienced and 2 have got experience, then that's just too much ground to cover. So we've got to look at, as part of our rebalancing of resources across the organisation, about rebalancing of supervisory experience. There's also the point I made earlier about skills. If we haven't given enough leadership and management training to those individuals, then that's hard on them. So lots of good people, but stretched too far and haven't always been invested in terms of their skill set, and we've got to help them with that. So my language about a lot of it's down to them is about our failure to help them rather than blaming them for not sorting it out. The BCU point again is that outside in perspective and the need to give them more centrality. One of the pieces of operational change that we're looking at internally is the balance of resources on our proactive teams. We have VCTF, TSG and others that are Met-wide resources, and then on a BCU level they have quite a range of different teams that they can task and deploy. There's probably too many teams, and the balance of where those resources are probably needs to tip more towards the local. And so the Deputy's been overseeing a piece of review work on that, which I expect to report in a couple of weeks, which I would expect to produce fewer teams with a different balance tipped towards the local. And then my third point on that is that the the work I mentioned earlier about a fresh look at stop and search, and picking up Louise's point, there are three things that interest me about stop and search. Is it effective in dealing with crime? Are we lawful? Does it build or damage trust? And we have looked hard at the first two historically. As Louise points out, we haven't looked so hard at the third one. And that's what we need to do. And that goes to how we deploy it. So it shouldn't just be deployed, whether that's by Scotland Yard or by a BCU commander based on dots on a map of crime. If there's a need for intense delivery of stop and search in an area, potentially, let's start from what's the problem. The problem is there's been a surge of knife crime, say. Actually, there should be a conversation with the community, if necessary in fast time, about, we're really worried about this, we're thinking of doing this, what do you think, can you support us, can you help us, what else can happen, what can the local authority do, can you move some cameras around, actually thinking about a joint approach to it rather than us just parachuting in a tactic which comes as a bit of a surprise to the community. So stop and search is critical, but we need to be more canny and thoughtful about how we deploy it. And that sort of thinking is all part of that, listening more to communities and involving BCU commanders in those conversations. So it all reflects, as you say, that bottom up rather than top down.
Conscious of what Louise told me about the bear pit that we can create here, I'm conscious that it's a very specific question that I'm asking, and that. But this, I am just concerned that you haven't quite answered the question of, if I'm an inspector and somebody comes to me and says, I've got here's a PC on my team who's making a complaint about misogynist or racist behaviour of his or her colleagues, and that inspector's got 100 things on their plate, and this is number 101. She highlights this in here. There needs to be a mechanism, doesn't there? It's all well and good saying this is an important thing for us as an organisation. It's an important cultural issue. But at the end of the day, people have got 24 hours in a day. How do you make sure that there is the capacity for those things to actually be dealt with? Because that seems to be a serious criticism that everyone sort of agrees, but how does it actually happen?
So that goes to the ratios point, if you've got the time and capacity or not. So that's why I made that point about supervisory ratios. I'm confident the vast majority of the leaders brought something really awful to their table. They will deal with it formally and they'll put it into the specialist people. That's not the test I'm most worried about. It's more the broken windows approach to this. So it's nipping things in the bud that sort of John is just a bit across the line of how he should behave. None of it's got to form misconduct, but I need to send a signal to the whole team that that's the line of behaviour and John is putting his toe across it. Because if you don't draw the line there, then that individual becomes emboldened and it gets worse. And I think it's those more subtle leadership skills and those interventions which actually can take much more time. If you're not confident about how you do it, then you might hesitate on them. I think that's the point of success or failure.
Okay.
The reporting the most serious thing to professional standards to do a better investigation, that will happen, and we're strengthening professional standards so they do a better job. It's more those boundary issues. And if you've got more time with your people, if you're only supervising 6 rather than 12, you stand more chance of getting that right.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. Your setting of the tone, I appreciate that. That is a rational way of saying that it's about changing priorities. So finally, can I just say, what's the mechanism for checking that that's happening?
So you can check on the formal. It's very hard to check on the informal, isn't it? So the informal you get from staff surveys, you get from other data, where we're trying to look at how can you spot healthy and unhealthy teams.
Very conscious of the chair glaring at me, so let me say it's about actively going looking and not waiting for someone to knock on your door. I think that's the point I'm trying to make. So how are we actively going looking?
Yeah, so it's about the radar point I was making earlier. It's about conversations, it's about data, it's about staff survey, the whole range of different things where you see that team looks healthy, that team doesn't. We need to dive in and look why.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. No.
We've got 10 minutes.
No, we haven't. We've got another thing to do. No. But if it's 2 seconds, but no more than that, quickly.
Sorry, Chair, can I just clarify?
No, all right. Well, we won't, because we've got to be finished by 1. We've got something else to go through. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I was just going to ask you, Deputy Mayor. that in light of everything you heard about what has been said about BCUs, would you consider doing a review into the effectiveness? Are the current structures fit for purpose? And this is a criticism that comes from leaders in my part of London, who are all Labour leaders, by the way.
Just very briefly, because
that doesn't make any difference. We're not bringing politics into this.
No, I'm just saying that up to my part of London.
Just very briefly, the policing crime plan did have already a commitment to a review of the impact of the BCU restructure, starting with public protection and child protection. What we've got to consider is how much a review we really need to undertake, given the analysis that is already in there, and we'll be discussing that with the leadership. But there was already that commitment in the policing crime plan that was published last March.
I strongly agree with what I thought Louise Casey said, which was a structural change is more likely to get in the way of getting to the culture than it is to have the effect that we want.
But structures are a way to solve issues as well.
Thank you. If you turn your microphone off, please. I think you've heard us that we're not happy with BCUs, and it was interesting for me to see it in the report. But I hear and understand what you're saying. I think I can say on behalf of the whole committee, we really wish you well with this, because it's absolutely essential that we have a trusted and respected police force in London for everybody's sake. And we do understand the morale issues this is going to cause with the rest of your staff, and we are completely behind you in sorting this out. So I'd like to thank our guests for attending the meeting today and answering the committee's questions. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
Thank you. Can we note the monthly report received from MOPAC?
Noted.
Thank you. Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman, in consultation with party group lead members, to agree any output arising from the meeting?
Agreed.
Thank you. And we're going on to the next section now, and I can see our guest outside. So thank you so much, both of you, for coming. We really appreciate your answers. I'm not going to stop the meeting, so that we'll just process, and we'll be finished by 1, as we should be. Thank you, Eben. Do come in. Thank you. I'd like to welcome Emma Strain, the GLA's monitoring officer. Would you like to very, very, very briefly introduce your report to the committee? Thank you. Yeah. That's not working. There we go. Thanks.
Thank you. So just very briefly, as I've set out in the paper, I received 2 complaints regarding the conduct of the Mayor in connection with the departure of Dame Cressida Dick from her role as the Commissioner of the Met Police, as considered by Sir Thomas Windsor in his report, and the contents of these complaints are set out in my report. As is required under the regulations, I recorded the complaints, and then I'm required to determine whether the complaints are serious complaints, as set out under the regulations. Complaints that are found to be serious complaints have to be referred to the Independent Office for Police Conduct to consider whether to investigate them. To help inform my assessment and determination as to whether these complaints are serious complaints, I've sought the opinion of a King's Counsel criminal barrister as to whether they are serious complaints, and that is whether they are complaints which are about the conduct which constitutes or involves or appears to constitute or involve the commission of a criminal offence. In the paper, I provided counsel's opinion, which sets out the law related to misconduct in public office and the application of the complaints to that offence of misconduct in public office. With regard to both these complaints, in counsel's opinion, the conduct complained of does not pass the threshold test for misconduct in public office and is not criminal in nature. So in consultation with the committee and taking into account the information gathered and the opinion of counsel, I've reached a conclusion that these complaints are not serious complaints under the regulations and therefore should not be referred to the Independent Office of Police Conduct. So these complaints will now be dealt with under the GLA's ethical standards regime for assessing complaints alleging a breach of the Code of Conduct for members.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have any questions? No? Okay, thank you. Thank you for that, Emma. So can I ask the committee to, A, note that after taking into account the committee's consultation response and King's Counsel advice, the monitoring officer has determined that the complaints identified in the report are not serious complaints under the elected local policing bodies, the Complaints and Conduct Regulations 2012. and note the consequences of this determination is that the complaints must now be dealt with under the GLA ethical standards regime for assessing complaints alleging a breach of the GLA's Code of Conduct for elected members. Can you note? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme and the recent activity undertaken, namely the informal meeting of the 1st of March 2023 with the Metropolitan Police Service on the topic of fraud?
Noted.
Thank you. The next meeting of the committee will be agreed at the London Assembly's annual meeting on the 4th of May 2023. I have no urgent business, so that concludes today's meeting.